Hello, my friend. Welcome to Sleepy Old World. Settle in, get comfortable. Because tonight we're stepping aboard the Titanic into everything the richest passengers in first class did after the sun went down. Things that would have seemed completely absurd to anyone travelling a few decks below them in second or third class. And yet, for the people actually living inside first class, were simply an ordinary Tuesday. A gown never worn twice in front of the same table. What unmarried women, and some who weren't quite as unmarried as they should have been, actually did the moment nobody from their own social circle was watching. Diamonds handed to a steward every single night and locked away like nothing at all. We're going to walk through a great many of these tonight slowly, one at a time, folded into the story of a handful of particular women's very ordinary, very extraordinary evenings at sea. Just a small moment before we begin. If these evenings bring you comfort, subscribing means more than you know, and a like helps this little channel keep going. Tell me in the comments where you're curled up tonight, maybe with the air conditioning humming low somewhere in Texas, or wrapped in a light blanket by an open window somewhere in Ohio. I will genuinely read every single one. All right, love, let's begin. Set aside for a moment the picture that is probably already forming in your head. The wide staircase. The clock with the two bronze figures standing guard above it. The sweep of oak panelling catching the electric light. Everyone begins there, and tonight we are not going to. I want to take you instead into a quieter space, a private one, on B deck, among the very finest staterooms on the entire ship, where a door is closing softly at 9 in the evening, and a woman is sitting alone at a small writing desk bolted to the wall, a single lamp lit beside her. The ship moving so smoothly beneath her that she has almost forgotten tonight that she is at sea at all. Maybe she is a banker's wife from Philadelphia, travelling home from a spring in Paris with a dozen trunks, her husband down the corridor in the smoking room right now, losing at cards politely enough that he will laugh it off by morning. Maybe she is a widow of considerable means, travelling with her own maid and her own private views on which of tonight's dinner guests bored her most. Maybe she is younger than that, newly married, still faintly astonished that this is her life now, that a ship can have a room like this one, papered and panelled and warmer than her childhood bedroom ever was in February. Whoever she is tonight, she is real enough to have a name we will never know, and specific enough that you might recognise a piece of her in someone you have met. Here is the thing nobody quite says about the richest passengers on that ship. They were, by every outward measure, having the best few nights of a great many lives. And they were also, some of them, faintly bored by it. Wealth at that altitude does something strange to an evening. It removes almost every obstacle between a person and their own comfort, and then it leaves that person alone with whatever is actually in their head once the obstacles are gone. The woman at the writing desk is not thinking about the size of her stateroom. She stopped noticing the size of her stateroom around the second day. She is thinking about a letter she has been meaning to write to her sister, and has not, and probably will not tonight either. Outside her closed door, the corridor carries the faint, particular smell of new carpet and machine oil, and very faintly the sea. A smell the White Star Line spent a great deal of money trying to minimise and never entirely could. That smell is worth pausing on for a second, because it is one of the small details most people never think to imagine. The most expensive ship in the world in April of 1912 still smelled, underneath the flowers and the polish, like a ship. There was no fixing that. Even the richest man aboard breathed it in every time he stepped from his stateroom into the passage. I find myself genuinely fond of that detail. It is the kind of thing that quietly undercuts the whole fantasy of frictionless luxury, the idea that enough money buys you out of every physical fact of the world you're moving through. It does not, quite. Not even here. Not even on this ship. Let me widen the frame a little before we settle further in, because I want you to actually see what an evening among the richest passengers on the Titanic was built from, piece by piece, before we get lost in any single room. There were, by the time the ship left Southampton, somewhere in the neighbourhood of 325 people travelling in first class. Not all of them were wealthy, in the way we tend to picture wealth today, with private rail cars and household staff numbering in the dozens, though a fair number of them were exactly that. Among them were industrialists, minnowners, a man who had made and lost and remade a fortune in real estate, the owner of a department store empire, a colonel, several society women travelling essentially for the pleasure of the crossing itself, and at least one passenger whose personal fortune, adjusted forward into today's terms, would have made him one of the wealthiest people alive in any country on any given afternoon. What almost none of the histories tell you, though, is how differently that wealth actually behaved once evening fell. During the day, first-class life on the Titanic had a fairly loose and social rhythm. Deck walks, letters, idle conversation in the reading room, a great deal of watching other passengers watch each other. But evening was when the ship's real architecture of privilege revealed itself, because evening was when the choices multiplied. A wealthy passenger on an April night in 1912 somewhere in the North Atlantic had more ways to spend the hours between dinner and midnight than almost any hotel on land could have offered at the time, and I want to walk you through several of them, not in one long unbroken scene, but the way an actual evening moved, restlessly, from one small world into the next. The first stop for most of them was dinner itself, and I want to be honest with you about something. Dinner on the Titanic was not one single event. It was, depending on your ticket and your inclination, at least two entirely different experiences happening in two entirely different rooms at the same hour. The larger and more famous of the two was the first-class dining saloon on D-deck, a room finished in white paint and Jacobean oak carving, seating well over 500 people at once beneath leaded glass windows that let in no actual daylight this late, only the warm electric glow behind them designed to imitate it. Long tables and small ones, white linen laid with a precision that took the stewards the better part of an hour, silver polished to a shine that caught the light from above and threw it back in small moving points across the room whenever anyone lifted a fork. Dinner here followed a structure that would have felt entirely familiar to any of these passengers from their lives on land. 10 courses on a typical evening, moving from hors d'oeuvres and oysters through consommé, poached salmon, filet mignon, a saddle of lamb, roast duckling, a punch served cold between the heavier courses to clear the palate, and on toward pâté, cold asparagus vinaigrette, peaches in chartreuse jelly, and finally, coffee. It is worth sitting with that for a second. 10 courses. On an ordinary Sunday evening at sea, most of the people eating that meal would not finish all 10. Nobody expected them to. The point was never really to eat 10 courses. The point was that 10 courses existed, that the option was there, silent and total, the way the size of a house says something even to the people who never walk into half its rooms. But the truly wealthy passengers, the ones who wanted something more private and more curated than even that grand room could offer, often skipped the main saloon entirely in favour of the à la carte restaurant 2 decks above, a smaller and considerably more exclusive space run under contract by an outside restaurateur rather than by the White Star Line's own kitchens. This was the room modelled deliberately on the Ritz in Paris, all soft French walnut panelling and rose-coloured curtains, small tables instead of long communal ones, a menu you ordered from individually rather than a fixed procession of courses arriving whether you wanted them or not. A dinner here cost extra, on top of an already considerable first-class fare, and that extra cost was in some ways the entire point. It filtered the room down to those who wanted specifically to be filtered. Maybe she is one of the women dining there tonight, at a small table for 4 near the window, in a gown of pale silver silk that took her maid the better part of an hour to lace and pin correctly, listening to a string trio playing softly enough that it never once interrupts the conversation it is meant to accompany. Maybe she has ordered the same 3 courses she always orders on a ship. Out of a mild superstition, she would never admit to a soul. Maybe the man across the table from her is not actually her husband, but her husband's business partner, and the two of them are having, underneath a perfectly ordinary conversation about the weather in New York, an entirely different and much more careful conversation about money. That detail, the small superstitions wealthy travellers carried with them even into rooms built to eliminate every possible source of anxiety, is one I find myself circling back to. You would think, wouldn't you, that enough comfort erases the need for ritual. It does not. If anything, the very wealthy on a ship like this one seem to lean into small private rituals more, not less. precisely because so much of the rest of the evening had been arranged for them by other hands. Ordering the same dish twice, sitting at the same table each night if the restaurant would allow it. Small anchors in an experience that was, for all its polish, still fundamentally strange, still a floating hotel moving through open black water at 22 knots, with nothing solid beneath it for hundreds of miles in any direction. Here is a fact that tends to surprise people. The a la carte restaurant stayed open considerably later than the main dining saloon, sometimes past 11 at night, and it became, almost by accident, the informal late gathering point for a particular set of first-class passengers who wanted the evening to keep going past the point where dinner technically ended. Small parties formed there without any planning at all, someone waving over an acquaintance from another table, chairs pulled up, a second dessert nobody quite needed appearing anyway because someone insisted. This was, in its own quiet way, one of the truest luxuries the ship offered its wealthiest guests. Not the food itself, though the food was extraordinary. The simple ability to decide at 10 in the evening that the night was not yet finished, and to have an entire staffed room ready to agree with you. From dinner, the evening tended to split cleanly along a line that would look almost comically old-fashioned to us now, but that governed nearly every wealthy household on either side of the Atlantic in 1912 without a second thought. The men went one way, the women went another, not out of any single rule posted anywhere, but out of a social current so strong it did not need to be written down. For the men, that current led, more often than not, toward the first-class smoking room, on a deck, a room I think deserves far more attention than it usually gets in the way people picture this ship. Picture dark mahogany, not the bright white and gold of the grand staircase, but something heavier and more shadowed, inlaid with small mother-of-pearl designs, stained glass windows set into the walls that let in no outside light at all, since the room sat deep in the ship's interior, an open coal fire, an actual fire burning behind a brass surround at one end of the room, which on a ship otherwise run entirely on electricity and steam, felt like a small, deliberate return to something older and warmer. This was where the real business of the evening happened, if you want to call it business. Card games, mostly bridge, sometimes poker played more quietly in a corner, cigars, brandy, a level of conversation that ranged from genuinely serious, men discussing steel prices and railway consolidations and the political situation in Europe, to utterly trivial, the same men arguing happily about horses or golf handicaps an hour later. Stewards moved through constantly and almost invisibly, refilling glasses before anyone had to ask, emptying ashtrays, present in the way that only truly well-trained service staff managed to be present, which is to say barely at all. Maybe he is a man who made his money in steel, and has never once in 30 years told a story about how he actually made it, because the story is duller than people expect, and he has learned that mystery serves him better than accuracy. Maybe he is young, travelling on his father's money and slightly aware of it, laughing a beat too loudly at every joke told by the older men at his table, because their approval still matters to him more than he would ever say out loud. Maybe he lost $40 at cards tonight, and will not think about it again by breakfast, because $40, to him, is the cost of an evening's entertainment and nothing more. There is something worth sitting with in how much of wealthy male sociability in this era ran specifically through small, ritualized games of chance. It was not really about the money changing hands, which was rarely large enough to matter to anyone at these particular tables. It was about a controlled low-stakes arena for exactly the kind of competitive posturing that these men were not otherwise permitted to display in polite company. You could not simply announce you were more clever than the man across from you. You could, however, beat him at bridge, and everyone at the table would understand perfectly well what had actually just happened. Meanwhile, on the other side of that same deck, a very different rhythm was unfolding in the first-class reading and writing room, which functioned, on any given evening, as the closest thing the ship offered to a dedicated women's space, though nothing barred men from entering it, and some did. This room was quieter by design, decorated in a pale, almost delicate palette of white and rose, with a large bay window at one end that during the day offered one of the best views on the ship, and at night became simply a dark mirror reflecting the room's own lamplight back into itself. Here, letters got written, the kind meant to be posted the moment the ship reached New York, full of details about the crossing that would already feel slightly stale by the time they arrived, since the traveller herself would likely arrive only days behind the letter. Here, quiet conversations happened between women who had known each other for decades, and women who had met only 3 days earlier over lunch and discovered, the way strangers sometimes do at sea, an unexpected ease with each other that neither one entirely understood. Someone was usually reading a novel or the ship's own daily newspaper, printed on board each morning from wireless news received overnight, a genuine technological marvel that most of these passengers accepted with barely a flicker of wonder, because wonder too becomes ordinary once you can afford enough of it. I want to slow down on one detail here, because it is the kind of thing that never makes it into the documentaries. The writing desks in this room were stocked with the ship's own stationery, cream-coloured paper embossed with a small white star-line flag at the top, and passengers used an enormous quantity of it over the course of the crossing, not only for necessary correspondence, but for the simple pleasure of writing on paper that announced, in its own quiet printed way, exactly where you had been. Some of that stationery survives still, in private collections and museum cases, the ink slightly faded now, the handwriting of people whose evening this was, describing an entirely ordinary Tuesday that none of them yet understood would become the most examined evening of their lives. There was music running underneath nearly every hour of this, and I think it deserves its own moment before we move on, because we tend to flatten the Titanic's orchestra down to a single tragic image, and that image, however true it eventually became, is not actually what these musicians spent most evenings doing. The ship carried 2 separate small ensembles, a quintet that typically played in the reception area outside the main dining saloon before and after dinner, and a trio that often performed in the Café Parisien or the à la carte restaurant, a lighter, more café-style sound, suited to a room built to feel like a Paris sidewalk transplanted onto a steel hull. The repertoire leaned toward what audiences of the time considered pleasant background music: waltzes, light classical pieces, the occasional popular song of the day, nothing demanding, nothing meant to be truly listened to so much as felt, ambient in the truest sense, filling the silence between courses and conversations without ever asking anyone to stop talking and pay attention. And that, I think, is worth noticing. The music that filled these rooms every single night of the crossing was engineered, quite deliberately, to be almost unnoticeable, pleasant wallpaper for the ears. It worked exactly as intended for 4 nights running, which is precisely why almost nobody who lived through those first evenings later remembered a single specific piece the orchestra played. Maybe she is a woman standing near the reception room doorway after dinner, only half listening to the quintet, waiting for her husband to finish a conversation with a business acquaintance so they can go up to the promenade deck for air before bed, tapping one gloved finger lightly against her evening bag, in time with a waltz she could not name if you asked her. Let me take you outside now, because I think the promenade deck at night is one of the most underappreciated spaces on this entire ship, and almost nobody talks about it. During the day, the covered promenade on A deck was a place for walking, for deck chairs, for that particular Edwardian ritual of being seen taking gentle exercise in expensive outerwear. At night, though, especially after 10, it emptied out considerably, and the handful of passengers who still walked it found something genuinely different waiting for them. Cold. Real cold. The kind that cut straight through even a fur-lined coat once the ship had moved far enough north and west into colder water. Colder than most of these passengers, used to milder Atlantic crossings at other times of year, had quite anticipated. And above that cold, on a clear night, an extraordinary field of stars, unpolluted by any city light for hundreds of miles in every direction. A sky most of these wealthy travellers, accustomed to the softened, glowing night skies of London and New York and Paris, had likely not seen with this kind of clarity in years, possibly decades. There are more than a few surviving accounts, letters and later recollections both, describing exactly this, the strange, vivid brightness of the stars on those April nights, the ship's own lights the only competing glow anywhere, warm and yellow against black water, and a sky gone almost impossibly clear and cold. I find something quietly moving in that. All that engineered luxury below decks, the mahogany and the 10-course dinners and the orchestras playing waltzes nobody would remember, and then you step outside for 5 minutes and the only thing actually competing for your attention is the oldest show there is. A steward or two still moved along this outer deck even this late, checking deck chairs, offering blankets to anyone who lingered, present but unobtrusive in exactly the way first-class service demanded. Somewhere below, several decks down and worlds away in every practical sense, other passengers were experiencing this same ship, this same night, this same cold Atlantic air, in an entirely different register, and I want to hold that thought gently for a moment rather than rush past it, because it matters to understanding what evening on this ship actually meant, and for whom. Here is the contrast, plainly, because I think it is more powerful stated simply than dressed up. A third-class passenger on the Titanic paid something in the range of £7 to £9 for the entire crossing. A first-class passenger in one of the finest suites paid closer to £870, a figure that in today's terms would run well into 6 figures for a single ticket. That gap was not incidental, it was the entire architecture of the ship. Steel decks and locked gates separated the classes not out of casual snobbery alone, though there was plenty of that too, but because maritime regulation at the time required certain physical separations between classes for public health reasons, a policy with real origins in earlier decades of immigration and disease control that had by 1912 calcified into something closer to simple social sorting. Third-class passengers had their own evening rhythms too, and they were not without pleasure. There was dancing some nights, an accordion or a fiddle producing music considerably more alive and less curated than the quintet upstairs, a general room where people gathered to talk and sing in half a dozen languages at once. I do not want to paint that world as uniformly grim, because it was not, but I do want you to hold both pictures at once for a moment, the 10-course dinner and the general room sing-along, happening at the same hour, on the same ship, moving through the same black water, because that contrast is, in its own way, the truest single fact about what this ship actually was, a floating cross-section of an entire society's inequality, built to move at 22 knots and finished in mahogany at one end and painted steel at the other. Let us come back upstairs now, because there is more to see in the first-class world before the night winds down, and I promised you variety, not a lecture. Past 11, with dinner long finished and the smoking room still comfortably full, a smaller and more particular group of first-class men sometimes made their way down to the squash racket court on G-deck, or to the gymnasium on the boat deck, both of which, remarkably for a passenger ship of this era, remained accessible surprisingly late for anyone determined enough to use them. The gymnasium in particular was a genuine novelty, outfitted with mechanical rowing machines, a stationary cycling machine, and an electric horse that jolted riders with a motorized gait meant to simulate an actual trot. All of it operated under the supervision of an instructor whose job, on most nights, mostly involved demonstrating the equipment to curious passengers rather than actually training anyone in earnest. Maybe he is a younger passenger, restless after too many courses and too much wine, working off some of that restlessness on the rowing machine at 11:30 while a friend watches from a nearby bench and laughs at him for trying so hard on holiday. There is something almost sweetly ordinary about that image, a young man exercising alone in an empty gymnasium late at night on the most famous ship in the world, doing something you might do yourself on any given Tuesday. The Turkish bath suite, one deck below, told a different and stranger story. Modelled loosely on the ornate steam baths of Cairo and Damascus, all carved teak and gilded Moorish tilework and dim-tinted light filtering through stained glass. This was one of the ship's most exotic and expensive amenities, and it typically closed by evening rather than staying open into the night, its heat and steam better suited to an afternoon of relaxation before dressing for dinner than to the late hours we are exploring now. But the room itself, empty and cooling by 10 at night, its tiles still faintly warm to the touch, its air still carrying the ghost of eucalyptus and steam from hours earlier, is worth pausing on for its sheer strangeness. A full Ottoman-inspired bathhouse, built into the hull of a British ocean liner, silent now, waiting for morning, one small closed door among hundreds on a ship where almost every closed door concealed some deliberate small fantasy of somewhere else entirely. Let us slow down here for a moment, because I want to talk about what it actually took to arrive at dinner looking the way these women looked, since that preparation was, in its own right, a kind of evening event long before anyone sat down to eat. A first-class woman crossing on the Titanic typically travelled with multiple trunks dedicated almost entirely to evening wear, gowns in silk and satin and chiffon, often ordered from Paris houses just months earlier, some of them worn only once during the entire crossing because appearing twice in the same gown, in front of the same small rotating circle of dining companions, carried its own faint social cost that these women understood without ever needing it explained to them. Dressing for dinner began, for most of them, somewhere between 6 and 6:30, roughly 90 minutes before the first course was served. A lady's maid, if she travelled with one, and a great many of the wealthiest women did, would already have laid out the evening's gown, the correct undergarments beneath it, the jewellery selected days or even weeks earlier back on land, and packed specifically with this particular evening in mind. Hair came first, usually, built up and pinned into one of the elaborate upswept styles fashionable that year, sometimes incorporating hairpieces, sometimes not, depending on what nature had provided and what an evening this formal seemed to demand. Jewellery deserved its own small pause. The wealthiest women aboard travelled with genuinely extraordinary pieces, diamond necklaces and pearl ropes worth, in some documented cases, sums that would have purchased entire buildings on land, carried in small locked cases that stewards treated with the particular careful deference reserved for cargo everyone silently understood to be irreplaceable. Wearing that jewellery to dinner each night was not simple vanity, or not only that, it was a form of quiet, constant communication, a way of stating, without a single word exchanged, exactly where a woman and her family stood in a room full of people who could all read that language fluently and would have been faintly startled if asked to explain the rules of it aloud. Maybe she is a woman fastening a string of pearls at her own throat because her husband disappeared toward the smoking room an hour ago, and her maid is occupied with something in the next room, working the clasp by feel in the mirror's low light, faintly annoyed and not remotely surprised. Maybe she chose the sapphires tonight instead of the diamonds because she overheard at lunch that a particular rival dining companion would be wearing diamonds herself, and two women in diamonds at the same small table felt, to her, like an unnecessary redundancy. I do not say that last part to be unkind. I say it because it is true, and because it is, in its own strange way, wonderfully human. Enormous wealth did not remove these small competitive instincts from the passengers who carried it. If anything, it gave those instincts a more elaborate stage to perform on. The social hierarchy running underneath all of this politeness was, in its own way, every bit as rigid as anything below decks, just quieter about it. Even within first class, there were gradations that mattered enormously to the people living inside them and would be almost invisible to us now. Old money looked differently at new money, however cordial the surface conversation remained. American industrial fortunes, several decades old by 1912, still carried a faint whiff of the factory floor to certain older European titled families travelling in the same class, a distinction nobody stated outright and everybody understood perfectly. Introductions mattered. Who had been formally presented to whom, by which mutual acquaintance determined who could speak freely to whom across a dining room, and who required a proper introduction first, even after 4 days aboard the same ship. A few of the names travelling in first class that week are still remembered today, and I think it is worth naming some of them plainly, not as gossip, but as genuine historical texture. Colonel John Jacob Astor IV, one of the wealthiest men in America, was aboard with his young second wife, returning from an extended honeymoon abroad. Isadore and Ida Strauss, the couple behind Macy's department store, were travelling home together after months in Europe, a marriage of considerable warmth that people who knew them commented on specifically, even at the time. Benjamin Guggenheim, of the mining and smelting fortune, was aboard as well. Margaret Brown, a Denver mining fortune in her own right, later remembered by history under a nickname she never actually used in her own lifetime, was among the more independently spirited women in first class that week, known even before the crossing for a directness that some of the more conventional passengers found either refreshing or faintly improper, depending on who you asked. I mention them not to turn this into a list of names, which would run counter to everything this evening is supposed to be, but because knowing that real, specific, complicated people were living through these ordinary rituals, dressing for dinner, choosing jewelry, worrying faintly about a rival's necklace, makes the whole picture more honest than any generic account of wealthy people on a large boat ever could. Let us go back to the card tables for a moment, because I skimmed past something worth returning to. Bridge, in 1912, was not the slightly old-fashioned pastime it might sound like to modern ears. It was, among exactly this class of people, something closer to a genuine social technology, a structured way of spending hours in close company with strangers and acquaintances alike, without ever having to generate conversation from nothing. The game gave everyone something to do with their hands and their attention, a shared task that made silence comfortable and small talk unnecessary, which is, if you think about it, a remarkably useful thing to have available on a 4-day crossing full of people who had often just met. Stakes in the smoking room varied considerably. Some tables played for genuinely trivial sums, pennies essentially, the money itself irrelevant, the scorekeeping the only point. Other tables, tucked into quieter corners, played considerably higher, and it was here that a particular and slightly less respectable figure sometimes appeared. The professional card sharp, travelling under an assumed respectability, working the first-class smoking rooms of transatlantic liners as a genuine, if unglamorous, occupation. Several such men are known to have been aboard the Titanic that week, moving through the smoking room with practiced, unhurried charm, losing small early hands deliberately to establish trust before the stakes climbed. It is a strange thought that even inside the most exclusive room on the most exclusive deck of the most exclusive ship afloat, someone was quietly working an angle. Maybe he is one of the marks rather than one of the operators tonight. A young man travelling alone for the first time without his father's guidance, flattered by the easy friendliness of an older gentleman who seems to have taken a genuine liking to him, not yet realizing that the friendliness has a purpose. Maybe he loses more than he should tonight, and will spend tomorrow's breakfast quietly working out how to mention it to no one at all. Past midnight, the smoking room thinned but rarely emptied entirely. A handful of the most committed card players and the most restless insomniacs among the wealthy tended to stay latest of all, and the room's character shifted again in these final hours, quieter, the conversation slower and more confiding, the kind of talk that happens specifically because it is late and everyone present has tacitly agreed the ordinary social rules of daytime candor no longer fully apply. Men said things at 1 a.m. in that smoking room that they would not have said at 7 in the evening, business worries, marriages that were not going particularly well, a quiet, unresolved grief for a parent 2 years gone that had never quite found its moment until now. I do not want to overstate that. Most nights in that room were simply pleasant and unremarkable, cigars and cards and mild gossip. But late-night rooms like this one, on ships and everywhere else, have a particular gravity to them, and I think it is worth naming that gravity, rather than pretending every first-class evening was pure surface and polish. The library, situated forward on a deck, offered an entirely different late-evening register, quieter still, almost monastic by comparison. Shelves of leather-bound volumes, deep armchairs, good reading lamps, and a stillness that a determined passenger could actually find nowhere else on the ship after 10 at night. A handful of people used this room the way readers have always used libraries, as a genuine retreat, an hour of actual solitude purchased at the cost of simply choosing not to be anywhere more social. Maybe she is a widow travelling alone, several years past the loss that still shapes most of her days, finding in this particular room, on this particular ship, a kind of peace she has not felt reliably anywhere on land in longer than she would care to admit. The billiard room, by contrast, stayed livelier, a masculine space adjacent to the smoking room, where the click of ivory balls provided its own steady, almost hypnotic rhythm under the electric lights. Men leaning over green bays in shirt sleeves with jackets discarded on nearby chairs, a room where formality relaxed just slightly compared to the dining saloon 2 decks below, enough that a joke landed a little louder, a laugh carried a little further down the corridor outside. There was a version of this evening reserved specifically for the unmarried young women aboard, and it operated by a slightly different set of rules than everything we have covered so far. Rules so ingrained that none of the young women living inside them would have called them rules at all, only common sense. A young unmarried woman of good family did not simply wander the ship's public rooms alone after dinner. She travelled, in the evening hours especially, within a small orbit, a mother, an aunt, an older married friend of the family, someone whose presence rendered her own presence in a public room entirely respectable, rather than faintly scandalous. This chaperonage was not usually experienced as oppressive by the young women living inside it, or at least not consistently so. It was simply the water they swam in, as unremarkable to them as it would feel remarkable and restrictive to us. What it did produce, though, was a particular kind of evening choreography for courtship, conducted almost entirely in public rooms, under supervision, through a language of small permitted gestures, a dance at one of the ship's informal evening gatherings, a conversation held standing near enough to a chaperone that propriety was satisfied, far enough that an actual private exchange could still happen underneath the surface one. Maybe she is 19, travelling with her mother, and a great deal of unspoken pressure to make a suitable match before the season properly begins back in New York, and she has spent this entire crossing quietly, carefully, deciding what she actually thinks of a particular young man 3 tables over in the dining saloon, weighing his conversation, his manners, the way he treats the stewards, against a picture of her future she has been assembling, piece by piece, since she was perhaps 12 years old. Maybe tonight, after dinner, in the reception room, he asked her opinion of a book she had not actually read, and she answered honestly that she had not read it, and something in his face when he laughed at that, genuinely and without any edge of mockery, told her more about him than 3 days of careful supervised conversation had managed to. There is a real sweetness in that kind of evening, underneath all the formality, and I do not want to flatten it into pure social mechanics. These were, many of them, young people genuinely trying to find their way toward a life they wanted, using the only tools their era had actually given them. Champagne moved through nearly every one of these rooms as the evening deepened, and it is worth pausing on the sheer quantity the ship carried for exactly this purpose. The Titanic's stores included thousands of bottles of wine and spirits, an inventory calculated with real precision by White Star Line's provisioning department, who understood perfectly well that a first-class crossing without an abundant and visible supply of good champagne would have registered, to these particular passengers, as a genuine failure of hospitality rather than a minor oversight. A toast here, a celebratory bottle there for an engagement announced, or a business deal quietly concluded over dinner, a glass simply because the string trio was playing something pleasant and the night felt, for a moment, worth marking. Coffee and liquors followed most dinners, served in the reception room or carried through to the smoking room and the reading room respectively, along with small sweets, petit fours, and for the men specifically, the ritual selection of an after-dinner cigar, a genuine small ceremony in its own right, the steward presenting a box, the passenger turning one carefully between his fingers before the cutting and the lighting, a pause built entirely around the pleasure of anticipation rather than the smoking itself. Let me take you to one more room before we move deeper into the night, because it is easy to overlook and I think it deserves its moment. The Café Parisien, situated just off the a la carte restaurant on B deck, was one of the newest and most talked about spaces on the entire ship, a sunlit, trellised sidewalk cafe built indoors, complete with ivy trailing along light wicker furniture and windows designed to fold back in warmer weather, though on this particular crossing, in the cold of an early April Atlantic, they stayed firmly closed. It was meant to evoke a Paris pavement cafe, and by every account, it succeeded well enough that passengers genuinely spoke of it that way, an odd small pocket of imagined France floating somewhere north of the Grand Banks. In the evening, this room filled with a younger and slightly more relaxed crowd than the main restaurant next door. Couples and small groups who wanted the same excellent food without quite the same degree of formality. Laughter carrying a bit more freely here than in the grander rooms elsewhere on the ship. Maybe she is a young wife on her honeymoon, sharing a late supper here with her new husband, both of them still faintly disbelieving that this particular life, this particular ship, this particular room, with its trailing ivy under electric light meant to look like sun, actually belongs to them now. Honeymooning couples were, in fact, a notable presence in first class that week, several of them travelling home from extended wedding trips through Europe, and their evenings carried a texture distinct from the rest of the ship's social rhythm. Less card playing, less smoking room politics, more quiet dinners lingered over, more early departures from the larger gatherings toward the privacy of a shared stateroom. Nobody remarked on this particularly, because it was expected, the natural and entirely visible shape of a marriage still new enough to prefer its own company most evenings. Not every wealthy passenger's evening moved at the pace we have been describing either. A number of the older passengers aboard, some travelling for health reasons, some simply weary from a long trip abroad and looking forward mainly to reaching home, kept to a considerably quieter rhythm. Dinner early, a short conversation afterward in the reception room, and then a retreat to their staterooms well before 10, letting the rest of the ship's evening continue on entirely without them. There is no drama in that kind of evening, and I think that is precisely why it is worth mentioning. Not every first-class passenger on this ship was living inside a glittering set piece every single night. Some were simply tired, in the ordinary way anyone gets tired on a long journey, wanting nothing more elaborate than a warm room and an early close to the day. The handful of children travelling in first class had their own separate evening entirely, tucked away by nurses or governesses well before the adult rituals of dinner properly began. Fed earlier and more simply in the nursery spaces set aside for exactly this purpose, put to bed at an hour that felt, to them, both entirely ordinary and faintly magical, since even an ordinary bedtime aboard a ship this large carried its own quiet wonder, the low hum of the engines audible even through a nursery door, the strange rocking stillness of a room that never quite stopped moving. Let us slow all the way down now, because the night is getting late, and I want the rest of this to move at the pace an actual late evening moves, unhurried, a little hazy at the edges, one small scene folding gently into the next. Consider the walk back to a stateroom after an evening like this one. A first-class corridor on B or C deck at 11 at night was quiet in a way the public rooms never quite achieved, carpet thick enough to swallow footsteps almost entirely, electric wall sconces spaced at even intervals casting a warm, low light that made the long straight passage feel shorter than it actually was. A woman walking this corridor on the arm of her husband, her evening gown trailing slightly against carpet that had been vacuumed only that afternoon by a steward she would never meet or think about, might pass another couple doing exactly the same thing, a brief nod exchanged, a murmured good night. The particular closeness that comes from 4 days of sharing a ship with the same several hundred faces, until they have all become, in some loose sense, familiar. Inside the stateroom itself, waiting for her, the real machinery of a wealthy woman's nighttime ritual would already be underway if she travelled with her own maid, or would begin the moment she arrived if she did not. The unlacing of a formal evening gown was not a simple task. Hooks at the back, sometimes dozens of them, required steady, practiced hands working in a mirror's reflected light, or by feel entirely if the maid had done this particular gown enough times to no longer need to look. Beneath the gown, the layers continued, a boned corset that had shaped her silhouette all evening now loosened stay by stay, each one releasing a small increment of pressure her body had simply stopped registering as pressure hours earlier, the way any sustained discomfort eventually recedes into simple background sensation. There is a particular, quiet pleasure in that moment of release that almost nobody writing about wealthy Edwardian women ever properly describes, and I think it deserves a sentence or two here. The exhale, genuinely physical, that came with the final loosening of a corset laced snugly enough for an evening of formal dining, the strange lightness of a body finally allowed to simply exist in its own shape again after hours of careful architecture. Maybe she sits at her dressing table for a moment afterward, still in her chemise, simply breathing, before reaching for the soft cotton or silk nightgown laid out and waiting, before her maid begins the far gentler work of taking down and brushing out hair that took an hour to build up earlier that same evening. The hairbrush itself, silver-backed, monogrammed, one of a matched set she has travelled with since her wedding, moves through her hair in long, unhurried strokes, 100 of them by old habit, though nobody has ever actually counted to verify the number matters, some quiet ritual passed down from a mother or a grandmother, kept mostly because keeping it feels like keeping something else too, some thread back to women who came before her and performed this same small evening act in rooms considerably less grand than this one. The room itself deserves a moment too, because a first-class stateroom on the Titanic, particularly one of the finer parlour suites, was genuinely unlike anything most passengers had experienced aboard a ship before. Two of the very grandest suites, on B-deck, came with their own private promenade decks attached, an entirely enclosed stretch of open-air walkway reserved for the exclusive use of whichever family had booked that particular suite, a luxury so pronounced that even other first-class passengers regarded it with a kind of respectful, faintly envious awe. These suites ran to multiple connected rooms, a sitting room done in a specific period style, Empire or Louis XVI, or a more restrained Georgian, a private bedroom, sometimes two, a private bathroom at a time when even many first-class staterooms shared facilities down the corridor, and rates that placed them among the most expensive tickets ever sold for passage across the Atlantic up to that point. Even the more modest first-class staterooms, the ones booked by passengers of considerable wealth but not quite the very uppermost tier, offered a standard of comfort that would have impressed most hotels on land. Electric heating controlled by the passenger themselves rather than fixed by the ship. A call button connecting directly to a steward or stewardess on duty at any hour. Proper beds rather than the built-in bunks common on older vessels. Real mattresses, real linen sheets changed daily. A wardrobe large enough to actually hold the extraordinary quantity of clothing these passengers travelled with. A steward's bell rung at this hour, past 11, past midnight even, was answered promptly and without complaint, because that promptness was, in itself, one of the primary products first-class fare actually purchased. A stewardess assigned to this particular corridor of staterooms might be woken from a brief rest in her own small cabin to bring a passenger a hot water bottle, a glass of warm milk, an extra blanket against a chill that had crept in more sharply than expected that particular night, and she would do it, however tired, with the same unhurried, cheerful competence expected of her at any hour of any day, because the fiction of effortless service, we have talked about this before in other stories, required that fatigue and inconvenience simply never show on a servant's face where a passenger might see it. Elsewhere on the ship, entirely apart from any of this, the Marconi wireless room continued its own separate nighttime rhythm, two operators working in shifts to send and receive messages across an increasingly crowded radio spectrum, since a ship this size and this famous attracted an enormous volume of personal telegrams from wealthy passengers eager to send word ahead to business partners and family in New York, brief clipped messages costing a premium per word, that meant even the richest passengers aboard wrote their telegrams with a certain economical discipline that their leisurely dinner-table conversation never required. Somewhere in among the routine business messages and social pleasantries passing through that small crowded room that week were also, as it happened, a number of ice warnings arriving from other ships further along the same shipping lanes, reports of field ice and bergs drifting further south than usual for the season, messages that were logged, and in some cases passed along to the bridge, and treated on an ordinary crossing in an era when such warnings were common enough in April, with the calm, practiced attention such warnings usually received. I mention that not to cast a shadow over the evening we have been describing, but because it is true, and because a story about this particular ship on this particular week owes you at least that much honesty folded gently in among everything else. The wealthy passengers dressing for dinner and dealing cards and brushing out their hair that week had no reason at all to think about it, and mostly did not. Let me back up for a moment and give you a fuller sense of an actual dinner menu, because the 10 courses I mentioned earlier are more interesting in their specific detail than in the abstract number. A first-class dinner that week might open with oysters, served on ice with a small wedge of lemon and nothing else, since the White Star Line's kitchens understood that the wealthiest palates aboard preferred their most expensive ingredients presented with the least possible interference. Consommé followed, a clear, rich broth requiring, in the professional kitchen technique of the day, hours of careful reduction and clarification through a raft of egg whites, a dish deceptively simple on the plate and genuinely laborious behind the scenes, the exact inverse of how it appeared to the person eating it, which is, if you think about it, true of nearly everything on this ship. Poached salmon in a mousseline sauce came next on many nights. The fish itself sourced and iced before departure, and kept in the ship's substantial cold storage rooms, alongside enormous quantities of meat, poultry and produce, since a 4 or 5 day crossing, carrying hundreds of first-class passengers through 10 courses a night, required provisioning on a scale closer to a small city than a single vessel. Filet mignon followed, a smaller cut than the roast courses to come, meant more as a bridge between the lighter fish course and the heavier meat still ahead than as a course to be lingered over. Lamb, roasted whole and carved tableside by attentive stewards working with practiced economy of motion, arrived next on many evenings, accompanied by mint sauce and a selection of vegetables prepared simply enough not to compete with the meat itself. Duckling followed on other nights, or occasionally both appeared across the same extended meal, roasted until the skin crisped and the fat rendered away, served with an orange or cherry reduction depending on the particular chef's preference that week. Between these heavier courses, a punch was often served, a small iced glass meant to clear and refresh the palate before the next round of rich food began, a genuine physiological courtesy built into the meal's architecture that most diners never consciously noticed even as their bodies quietly appreciated it. Pâté followed later in the sequence, along with cold asparagus dressed in a simple vinaigrette, a lighter interlude before the meal's sweeter conclusion. Dessert arrived in stages of its own, peaches preserved in a delicate chartreuse jelly, a selection of small French pastries, and finally cheese and fruit, the traditional closing note of a formal European-style dinner, before coffee and liqueurs moved the evening on toward its next room entirely. I want you to sit with the sheer scale of what that represents for a single evening meal, repeated with variation every single night of the crossing, for hundreds of first-class passengers simultaneously, prepared by a kitchen staff numbering in the dozens, working in conditions that were, by any modern standard, genuinely brutal, intense heat, constant noise, relentless timing pressure, all of it entirely invisible to the people eating 4 decks above in candlelit comfort. That invisibility was not an accident. It was, in its own way, the single most carefully engineered product this ship actually sold. Wine moved through each of these courses according to its own careful logic, a specific pairing selected for each dish, white wines with the fish course, a fuller-bodied red with the lamb, sweeter wines alongside dessert, champagne available throughout for anyone who preferred it regardless of what the formal pairing suggested. The ship's wine list ran to dozens of selections, French vintages predominantly, chosen and stocked by White Star Line's own wine buyers with a level of expertise that rivaled the finest hotels in London or Paris, because the passengers who could afford this ticket expected and would have immediately noticed the absence of exactly that level of expertise. Fashion aboard ran along lines that would have been instantly legible to any first-class passenger and largely invisible to anyone outside that world, and I think a few more specific details are worth adding here, because fashion of this kind was never actually about beauty alone. It was information worn on the body, updated nightly. 1912 sat at an interesting hinge point in women's fashion, the last full year before skirts began narrowing dramatically and silhouettes shifted toward the leaner lines that would define the years just before the First World War. Evening gowns that April still carried a certain Edwardian fullness through the skirt, waists defined though somewhat less rigidly corseted than a decade earlier, necklines often surprisingly bare by the standards of only a few years prior, a genuine and fairly recent loosening that the older women aboard sometimes commented on, not always approvingly, and the younger women aboard mostly took entirely for granted as simply how things were now. Men's evening wear carried far less room for individual variation, which was in its own way exactly the point. White tie for the most formal dinners, black tie increasingly acceptable for slightly less formal evenings, the uniform itself so standardized that a man's individuality at dinner had almost nowhere to express itself except through the smallest details, the cut of a waistcoat, the particular flower in a buttonhole, a watch chain slightly more elaborate than strictly necessary. Wealthy men of this era were not, on the whole, competing through visible display the way their wives so often were. Their wealth got expressed instead through the woman on their arm, through the size of the stateroom, through which particular table in the a la carte restaurant the headwaiter reserved for them without being asked twice. Entertainment after dinner sometimes moved beyond cards and conversation into something closer to genuine performance, though informally so. A passenger with a fine singing voice might be gently persuaded to perform in the reception room after dinner, accompanied by whichever member of the ship's small orchestra happened to be nearby with an instrument suited to the request. Charades appeared on some evenings among the younger set, played with the particular loose, giddy energy that comes from a group of people who have spent several days together in close quarters and grown comfortable enough to be a little silly with one another. An older gentleman, known aboard for his fund of amusing stories, might hold a small informal audience in the reception room for the better part of an hour, refilling his own brandy twice while he did it, savouring the attention as much as any performer on any stage. Gossip, of course, moved through all of this constantly, its own quiet undercurrent running beneath every polite conversation in every room we have visited tonight. Who had been seen dining twice this week with whom? Whose daughter seemed to be forming an attachment to whose son, and whether the families in question would actually consider the match suitable once the practical questions of money and lineage were properly weighed. Which gentleman in the smoking room had, according to someone who claimed to have it on good authority, lost considerably more at cards the previous evening than his easy manner tonight suggested. This informal information network moved faster and more thoroughly through first class than any of the ship's official channels, and it is worth remembering that for all the formal ritual and rehearsed politeness we have spent this evening exploring, these were, underneath everything, simply people, curious about each other, occasionally unkind about each other, deeply invested in each other's business in the specific way that happens whenever several hundred people who move in overlapping social circles find themselves confined together for several consecutive days. There is one particular evening worth telling more slowly than the others, because it happened, as far as the historical record allows us to say, largely as I am about to describe it, and it carries a weight the composite scenes we have been building tonight do not quite carry in the same way. On the last full evening of the crossing, a private dinner party gathered in the a la carte restaurant, hosted by a wealthy Philadelphia couple traveling home from an extended stay abroad, in honor of the ship's own captain, a widely respected commander nearing the end of a long and celebrated career, this crossing understood by many aboard to be among his last before a planned retirement. The guest list ran to a dozen or so of the ship's most prominent first-class passengers, seated at a table decorated, according to accounts from those who were there, with fresh flowers that had been kept in the ship's cold storage since departure specifically for an occasion like this one. Conversation moved easily across the usual comfortable ground: travel, mutual acquaintances, the captain's own long career at sea, a career that had by that point spanned decades and included command of some of the largest and most celebrated ships ever built. There was laughter at that table. There was real warmth. Several of the guests would later be remembered, by those who survived to remember anything at all, as having seemed in genuinely excellent spirits that particular night, unburdened, comfortable, entirely at ease, in exactly the way this ship had been built to make its wealthiest passengers feel. I tell you this not to cast a shadow forward over everything else in this story, and I want to be careful here, because that is not what tonight is for. I tell you this because it is real, because these were real people enjoying a real evening of genuine warmth and connection, and because I think there is something worth simply noticing in that, without dressing it up into anything more than it plainly was. An excellent dinner, good company, a toast, probably more than one, to a respected man's long career, the particular unrepeatable pleasure of a specific group of people enjoying a specific evening together, the kind every one of us has had at some point. the kind that felt while it was happening like it might simply go on being an ordinary lovely evening indefinitely, because that is how ordinary lovely evenings always feel from the inside. Let me stay with that feeling for a moment, that sense of an evening that felt endless from within it, because I think it is worth turning our attention now towards something gentler and slower, the particular quality of the night itself that week, since the weather across those days at sea was, by nearly every surviving account, remarkably still. The sea lay flat and glassy for long stretches, almost unnaturally calm for the North Atlantic in April, a stillness some of the more experienced travellers aboard remarked on specifically, having crossed this same ocean many times before and rarely, if ever, encountered water this quiet. A calm sea meant a calm ship, barely any of the usual rolling motion that ocean liners of the era were built to manage, but that passengers still generally preferred to avoid, and that calm shaped the entire texture of these evenings in a way easy to overlook. Dinners eaten without a single dish sliding, drinks poured without a steadying hand needed, an entire week of first-class luxury experienced at its absolute smoothest, least interrupted version. The sea itself cooperating, for these few days, with the fiction of total control this ship worked so hard to maintain. I want to follow one particular evening now, slowly, from beginning to end, the way it might have actually unfolded for one specific woman among the hundreds aboard, because I think there is more truth in one full evening followed closely than in a dozen more general observations. Call her Eleanor, though that is not her real name, only a name close enough to the kind of name a woman like her would have carried in 1912. She is 31 years old, married 9 years to a man who made his fortune in shipping, which she has always found a little amusing given where she is currently standing. They have no children yet, a fact that has occasioned more comment from relatives than either of them particularly appreciates, and that she has largely stopped explaining or defending to anyone at all. Her afternoon has already happened somewhere outside the frame of this story: a walk on the promenade deck, a light lunch, an hour spent writing letters she will not finish, a nap she did not intend to take, and woke from feeling faintly disoriented in the particular way afternoon naps aboard ship tend to produce, the light through the porthole having shifted just enough while she slept to make the room feel subtly unfamiliar for a moment or two. By 6, her maid, a quiet, capable young woman named Bridget, who has been with the family for 4 years now, is already laying out this evening's gown, a deep wine-coloured silk Eleanor bought in Paris only weeks ago and has been saving, with a small private discipline, for exactly this crossing. The dressing takes the better part of an hour, layer by layer, the corset laced to a comfortable snugness rather than anything dramatic, since Eleanor has never much cared for the more severe tight lacing some of her acquaintances still favour for formal evenings, finding it simply is not worth the discomfort for a pleasure she can achieve almost as well without it. Her hair takes longest, built up into a soft, fashionable arrangement that Bridget has clearly practised, since her hands move through it with a fluency that never once seems to hesitate over a decision. Jewellery tonight is simple by Eleanor's own standards, a single strand of pearls that belonged to her grandmother, small diamond earrings, nothing that announces itself too loudly, because Eleanor has decided, somewhere over the past several years of dinners exactly like this one, that quiet confidence photographs better in a room's collective memory than obvious display ever does. Dinner is in the main saloon tonight rather than the à la carte restaurant, since her husband has business acquaintances travelling in the larger room and wants, this particular evening, to be visible to them across the space rather than tucked away in a smaller, more private one. She does not mind. She has come, over 9 years of marriage, to genuinely enjoy the larger room's energy, the sheer scale of it, 500 people all performing roughly the same evening, in roughly the same way, and yet somehow, when you actually look closely, all doing it slightly differently. Conversation at her table runs through the usual comfortable channels. A couple travelling from Boston she has met twice before on other crossings, and always finds pleasant company. A younger unmarried woman seated with her mother, clearly hoping to be asked to dance later if any informal music starts up after dinner, glancing periodically toward a table of younger men 3 tables over, with a carefulness she probably believes is subtle, and is not remotely, not to anyone over the age of 25 watching from a slight distance. The meal moves through its courses at the unhurried pace these dinners always move at, and Eleanor, 4 courses in, finds her attention drifting the way it sometimes does at exactly this point in an evening like this one. Not from boredom exactly, more from a kind of pleasant fullness of experience that starts to feel, after enough courses and enough polite conversation, like too much of a good thing arriving all at once. She catches her husband's eye across the table at one point, and something passes between them, wordless, the particular shorthand of a long marriage, an acknowledgement that they are both here, both fine, both quietly looking forward to the moment this particular performance concludes for the night. After dinner, she declines the reception room in favor of a shorter stop in the reading room instead, wanting 10 quiet minutes before whatever comes next, and finds it easily, the room half empty at this hour, a single other woman reading by the window who looks up briefly, smiles, and returns to her book without either of them feeling any need to speak. There is a particular grace in that kind of shared silence between strangers, and Eleanor has always appreciated finding it when she can. Her husband finds her there eventually, having spent his own after-dinner hour in the smoking room in a conversation about steel prices he will barely remember by breakfast, and together they take a short turn along the covered promenade before retiring, the air cold enough to make her glad of the light wrap Bridget thought to have ready by the door. The sky, when they pause at the railing for a moment, extraordinarily clear, stars scattered in a density neither of them has seen this clearly in years. Back in their stateroom, the ritual of undressing unfolds in its familiar order, Bridget helping with the gown and the corset and the pins in her hair, the room warm from the electric heater, the bed already turned down by a steward earlier that evening, sheets crisp and slightly cool against skin, still faintly warm from the walk outside. Eleanor writes 3 lines in a small travel diary she has kept, out of habit more than genuine discipline, since 1903, nothing elaborate, just enough to remember, months from now, that this particular evening happened, that it felt, at the time, like an entirely ordinary and entirely lovely close to an entirely ordinary and entirely lovely day. She is asleep within 20 minutes of blowing out the small reading lamp, the engines a low, familiar hum beneath her, the ship moving on through calm black water toward a morning she has no particular reason to think about tonight at all. Let me follow a different evening now, a man's this time, because the shape of these nights looked genuinely different, depending on which side of that dining room split you found yourself on, and I think it is worth seeing that difference from the inside, rather than only being told about it. Call him Henry. He is 44, a widower these past 3 years, travelling home from a business trip to London that stretched, by his own quiet admission to almost no one, considerably longer than it strictly needed to, because there was nothing pulling him back to New York with any particular urgency, and a great deal in London that still felt, in some diffuse way he could not quite articulate, like company. He is not wealthy in the Astor or Guggenheim sense, but comfortably, solidly so, enough to book a good stateroom on B-deck and think nothing of it, enough that the à la carte restaurant surcharge registers to him as a mild extravagance rather than a genuine consideration. His evening begins later than Eleanor's did, because dressing for a widowed man travelling alone takes considerably less time than dressing for a woman travelling with a full evening's jewellery and hair to consider, and because Henry, if he is honest with himself, has never much enjoyed the process of getting ready for these formal dinners even when his wife was alive, to make the ritual feel like less of a chore. He dines tonight at a table of 6, 3 men and 3 women, none of them known to him before this crossing, all of them thrown together by the simple mechanics of the dining saloon's seating chart and finding, 4 days in, an easy rapport that surprises all of them a little. Conversation runs long and pleasant through most of the meal, and Henry finds himself talking more than he typically does at these things, drawn out by a genuinely curious older woman across the table who asks him, at one point, a direct and slightly unusual question about his late wife, not intrusive exactly, just direct in a way most polite dinner conversation studiously avoids being. He answers honestly, briefly, and feels something loosen in his chest afterward that he had not quite realized was tight. After dinner, he moves toward the smoking room out of habit more than enthusiasm, and finds the usual crowd there, cards already underway at 2 of the tables. cigars being selected and clipped and lit with the particular unhurried ceremony the room seems to encourage in everyone who enters it. He plays a few hands of bridge, loses a modest sum without much caring, and finds himself, somewhere around 10, in a longer conversation with a man he has just met that night. Another widower as it happens, the two of them discovering that particular quick intimacy that sometimes forms between strangers who recognize, almost instantly, a shared shape of loss neither one particularly wants to discuss, and both, somehow, feel understood by simply sitting near. They talk for the better part of an hour about nothing especially significant, business mostly, a little politics, a shared appreciation for a particular brand of scotch neither expected to find aboard, and both are pleased to have been wrong about. It is, Henry thinks, walking back to his stateroom sometime after 11, one of the better evenings he has had in longer than he would care to count, not because anything remarkable happened, but because for a few hours, in a smoking room full of strangers on a ship crossing an ocean he has crossed a dozen times before, he simply did not feel quite so alone. His stateroom is quieter than Eleanor's. No maid waiting, no elaborate ritual of pins and hooks to manage. Just Henry himself, working through his own considerably simpler routine, collar and studs removed and set carefully in a small dish on the dresser, evening clothes hung with the practiced economy of a man who has travelled alone, often enough to have made peace with doing these small things for himself. He reads for a while before sleep, a novel he brought aboard in London, and has been making slow, contented progress through all week, the reading lamp casting a small warm circle of light in an otherwise dark room, the engines humming their same low constant note beneath him that they hum beneath every stateroom on this deck, rich or otherwise, the one genuinely democratic sound on the entire ship. There is a whole layer of small mechanical novelties on this ship that I have not yet mentioned, and I want to fold a few of them in now, because they shaped these evenings more than people usually realize. The Titanic carried 3 passenger elevators serving first class, a genuine rarity aboard an ocean liner in 1912, operated by a young attendant who worked a lever by hand to move the car smoothly between decks, and who spent his entire evening shift making small, practiced conversation with whoever happened to be riding, since a first-class elevator attendant on a ship this exclusive was, in his own modest way, one of the more socially connected members of the crew, privy to 5 minutes of conversation with nearly every wealthy passenger aboard over the course of a single evening, though of course saying almost nothing himself beyond pleasantries, trained thoroughly in the particular skill of being present and invisible at the very same time. Each first-class stateroom of any real size carried its own telephone, an internal system connecting to the ship's own small exchange, allowing a passenger to ring the dining saloon to inquire about dinner timing or to ring a friend 3 decks away to arrange where to meet before the evening properly began. A genuine novelty that most of these passengers, accustomed to telephones on land only in the most modern homes and offices, still found faintly remarkable every time they picked up the receiver and heard a voice answer from somewhere else entirely within this same enormous floating structure. A barber shop operated aboard as well, tucked into sea deck, offering shaves and haircuts through the day and into the earlier evening hours, along with an assortment of postcards and small souvenirs that made it, oddly enough, one of the more social gathering spots for men wanting a few minutes of casual conversation outside the more formal registers of the smoking room or the dining saloon. Men drifted through here before dinner more than after. A quick trim, a hot towel, a few minutes of unhurried conversation with the barber himself, who had heard, over the course of this and countless other crossings, more genuine unguarded opinion from wealthy men relaxing in his chair than most of their own wives ever managed to extract at the dinner table. Below all of this, several decks down, in a part of the ship none of the passengers we have been following tonight would ever see or think about, an entirely different evening was unfolding on its own separate timeline, one governed not by dinner gongs and orchestra schedules, but by the relentless, unglamorous rhythm of keeping a ship this size actually moving. Firemen shoveled coal into furnaces in heat that reached well over 100 degrees, in shifts that rotated around the clock, without any concept of evening or morning mattering much at all down there, since the fires needed feeding at 3 in the morning exactly as urgently as they needed feeding at 9 at night. Engineers monitored pressure gauges and moving machinery in a deafening mechanical roar that made ordinary conversation nearly impossible without leaning close and raising your voice directly into a colleague's ear. I do not want to dwell on this too long tonight, because this story belongs, mostly, to the passengers upstairs, and I promised you their evening, not a full accounting of everyone aboard. But I think it is worth remembering every so often, as we move back up into the warmth and the polish, that the entire glittering evening we have been exploring floated, quite literally, on top of a labour most of its beneficiaries never once had caused to picture in any real detail. Back upstairs, the concept of leisure itself, the very thing this whole first-class world was organised around producing and displaying, was undergoing something of a quiet transformation across exactly this era, and a few of the more thoughtful passengers aboard, the kind who read serious books in the library rather than only novels, would have been at least glancingly familiar with newer social thinking, suggesting that a life visibly organised around leisure rather than labour had itself become, for the very wealthy, a genuine form of status display. The 10-course dinner and the idle afternoon, and the entirely unnecessary third gown of the week, functioning less as simple pleasures and more as a kind of continuous, unspoken announcement of exactly how far above ordinary necessity a person had risen. Whether any given passenger consciously thought about their own evening in quite those terms is another matter entirely. Most of them, I suspect, simply enjoyed their dinner. Etiquette itself was a subject taken with a seriousness that can feel almost comic to us now, and I think a few specific rules are worth naming plainly, because they governed these evenings far more than any of the passengers living inside them would have thought to mention out loud. A gentleman did not smoke in the presence of ladies, unless every lady present had explicitly indicated she did not mind, which is part of why the smoking room existed as such a firmly separate space in the first place. A lady did not initiate a conversation with a gentleman to whom she had not been formally introduced, regardless of how many days they had shared a dining table, though a great deal of genuine flirtation still managed to happen entirely within the narrow bounds of that rule, through glances and small deliberate proximities, and questions technically addressed to a third party, but clearly meant for someone else's ears. Correspondence carried its own etiquette too. A thank you note for any dinner invitation, however informal, was expected within a reasonable window, and several of the passengers aboard spent a portion of these evenings in the writing room, composing exactly such notes to hosts they had dined with only the previous night, a small continuous cycle of gratitude formally expressed that kept the entire social machine of the ship running smoothly, each dinner generating its own small paper trail of acknowledgement before the next one began. The ship's own daily newspaper, printed each morning aboard from wireless news received overnight and distributed to first-class staterooms with breakfast, gave passengers something to discuss over dinner beyond their own immediate circle. Stock prices from New York and London, brief items of political news from capitals thousands of miles away, occasionally a sporting result that sparked genuine debate at a dinner table otherwise inclined toward more genteel subjects. Reading this small daily paper became its own quiet ritual for many passengers, a strange pleasure in receiving actual current news while suspended in the middle of an ocean with no land visible in any direction, a genuine technological marvel, most of them absorbed with barely a comment, the way any sufficiently advanced comfort eventually just becomes Tuesday. Sleep itself, for all this luxury, did not always come easily to every passenger, and it is worth pausing on that honestly, rather than pretending every night aboard passed in perfect, untroubled rest. Insomnia was a genuine and openly acknowledged complaint among wealthy travellers of this era, and the era's remedies for it ranged from the entirely reasonable warm milk, a walk on deck before bed, a book read until the eyes grew heavy on their own, to the considerably less reasonable various patent tonics and sleeping powders sold under confident brand names and dispensed with a casualness that would alarm a modern physician considerably. A stewardess might be asked on any given night to bring a passenger a small glass of something meant to help them settle, and would do so without particular comment, since this was simply understood as part of the evening's ordinary small requests. No different in principle from an extra blanket or a second pillow. Maybe he is a man lying awake in his stateroom past midnight, not from any specific worry, simply from the particular restlessness that sometimes visits a person who has spent an entire evening being thoroughly entertained and finds, once the entertainment stops, that his own mind has nothing especially urgent to occupy it, and so it wanders instead, pleasantly enough, through nothing in particular, until sleep arrives on its own unhurried schedule, sometime past 1. Let me widen the lens one more time before we settle in for the rest of the night, because everything we have explored so far has moved through these evenings as though they were all essentially the same evening, repeated with minor variation, and that is not quite true. The crossing had its own arc, its own quiet rhythm of change across the few days it lasted, and I think that arc is worth walking through briefly, because it tells its own small story. The first evening, the night of departure itself, carried a different energy than any that followed, a kind of settling in quality, passengers still faintly disoriented by the sheer scale of the ship, still learning which staircase led where, still working out which of their fellow first-class passengers they already knew from previous seasons, and which were entirely new faces to be assessed and placed. Dinner that first night ran a little quieter than usual, conversation a touch more formal, everyone still on their best and slightly careful behavior in the way people always are on the first evening of any extended gathering with strangers, before the accumulated familiarity of shared days together has had any chance to soften the edges. By the second night, something had already shifted, the way it always does. Passengers who had exchanged only polite pleasantries the evening before now greeted each other by name across the dining saloon. The smoking room grew a little livelier, the card games a little more established, certain tables having already, in the space of one day, developed something close to a regular nightly gathering. Small alliances and small rivalries had begun quietly forming, the ordinary social chemistry of any group of people thrown together for several days, doing exactly what that chemistry always does, sorting itself, almost without anyone consciously choosing it, into familiar faces and preferred company. The third evening carried the crossing's most formal full-dress dinner, an occasion several of the women aboard had specifically planned their finest gowns around, understanding without needing to be told that this particular night, roughly midway through the voyage, functioned as the crossing's unofficial social centerpiece, the evening most likely to be remembered and discussed once everyone had returned to their ordinary lives on land. The dining saloon that night was, by every surviving account, an especially glittering scene. Jewelry at its most elaborate, conversation at its most animated, the orchestra playing to what felt, even to the musicians themselves, like a slightly more attentive audience than usual. And then came the fourth evening, the one we have already spent considerable time inside tonight, quieter in some ways than the third, the captain's small private dinner party unfolding in the à la carte restaurant, the wider ship settling into a comfortable, familiar rhythm that 4 days of shared company had fully established by now, everyone moving through these rooms with the easy confidence of people who genuinely know their way around, who know which steward remembers their preferred wine without being told twice, who know exactly which corner of the smoking room their particular circle has quietly claimed as their own for the duration of the crossing. There is something worth noticing in that arc, I think, the way even the most rehearsed and formal social world still manages to develop its own organic warmth given a few days to settle. These were not, by the fourth night, 400 strangers performing wealth at each other in careful isolation. They were, in whatever loose and temporary way shipboard acquaintance allows, something closer to a community, small and strange and entirely temporary, built to dissolve the moment the ship reached New York, and everyone scattered back into their separate, permanent lives. Let me tell you about the turn-down service specifically, because I mentioned it in passing earlier, and it deserves a fuller picture, since it is one of those small hospitality rituals that reveals, in miniature, exactly how thoroughly this ship had been designed around anticipating a wealthy passenger's every want before the want had even fully formed. Sometime in the early evening, while passengers were still at dinner or gathered in the public rooms, a stewardess assigned to each corridor of staterooms would move quietly through her section, turning down each bed, folding back the top sheet and blanket in a precise triangular fold, smoothing the pillow, sometimes leaving a small chocolate or a fresh flower on the pillow itself, depending on the particular steward or stewardess's own habits. since the White Star Line encouraged small personal touches of exactly this kind among its better staff, understanding that a passenger who noticed a single fresh flower on her pillow each night would remember that detail long after she had forgotten the specifics of any given dinner menu. Curtains were drawn. A reading lamp beside the bed was checked to ensure it worked properly. Slippers, if a passenger had left them out, were positioned neatly beside the bed, rather than wherever they had been kicked off that morning. The overall effect, walking into a stateroom at 11 at night, after a full evening of dinner and cards and conversation, was of a room that had been quietly, invisibly cared for in your absence, ready to receive you without a single further thought or effort required on your part, which was, of course, precisely the point, and precisely what an evening at this level of wealth was actually purchasing, not simply comfort itself, but the complete removal of any labor required to produce that comfort. I want to tell you about one more scene before we move toward the close of tonight's story, because it is a small, sweet one, and I think it belongs here. Late on the third evening, the night of the formal full-dress dinner, a young couple who had met for the first time only 2 days earlier through a shared acquaintance at the captain's table, found themselves alone together at the promenade deck, railing well past 11, the ship's music still faintly audible behind them through an open door, the sky above extraordinarily clear. Maybe he is the younger son of a shipping family, travelling home to take up a position his father has arranged for him and privately dreading, and maybe she is a young woman travelling with her aunt, considerably more independent-minded than her family entirely approves of, and maybe, standing at that railing with the cold air on both their faces and 4 days of surprisingly easy conversation behind them, something passed between them that neither one had fully expected to find on this particular crossing, an actual and unplanned attachment, the kind neither families nor fortunes had arranged in advance, forming quietly in the gap between one dance and the next. Nothing especially dramatic happened at that railing. No proposal, no declaration, nothing a novelist would feel obligated to dramatize. Just two people standing slightly closer together than strict propriety technically required, talking about nothing very important, both of them privately aware that something had shifted and neither one quite ready to name it yet. I think there is something worth honoring in that kind of small, undramatic, entirely real human moment, happening quietly at the edge of all this engineered luxury, unplanned by any of the careful social architecture the rest of the evening had been built around. Behind nearly every scene we have visited tonight stood a single figure most passengers barely registered by name, the chief steward, the man responsible for the entire orchestrated experience of first-class evening life, from the precise timing of each dinner course, to the correct temperature of every stateroom, to the exact rotation of which stewards worked which corridors on which nights. He held, in practice, something close to the authority of a hotel general manager over an establishment considerably larger and more complex than most hotels on land, and he exercised that authority almost entirely invisibly, through careful delegation and constant quiet supervision, rather than any visible display of command. His evening typically began well before the first passenger sat down to dinner, walking the dining saloon himself to check the table settings against the master diagram, tasting a sample from the kitchen to confirm the night's soup met his own exacting standard, reviewing the wine service with the head sommelier to ensure nothing had been miscounted or misplaced among the hundreds of bottles moving through the ship's cellars that week. He continued this quiet supervisory presence throughout the entire evening, moving between the dining saloon and the smoking room and the reception room with an unhurried watchfulness that most passengers, even those who noticed him at all, mistook for simple idle presence rather than the constant careful management it actually was. A genuinely skilled chief steward could anticipate trouble before it became visible to a single passenger. A table running slightly behind schedule, quietly reinforced with an extra server, a passenger's dietary restriction communicated ahead to the kitchen, so the correct course arrived without any awkward moment of explanation required at the table itself. A minor disagreement between two stewards resolved swiftly enough that no passenger ever glimpsed even a flicker of it. This was, in its purest form, exactly the invisible labor we have circled back to several times tonight, the entire elaborate machinery of first-class comfort resting, ultimately, on one man's constant, largely unacknowledged vigilance. Maybe you have known someone like this in your own life, the person at a large gathering or a busy household who seems to simply keep everything running smoothly without anyone quite noticing how much effort that smoothness actually requires. There is a particular kind of quiet dignity in that role, doing the work that makes an evening effortless for everyone else, and receiving in return mostly just the satisfaction of a night that unfolded exactly as it should have, with nobody upstairs any the wiser about everything that went into making it look so easy. Let me tell you a little more about the man who ran the gymnasium, because he was, in his own quiet way, one of the more memorable fixtures of the ship's evening life among the small circle of first-class passengers who used his facilities regularly. He was a physical culture instructor by trade, hired specifically for this ship, a cheerful and endlessly patient man who spent his days and a fair portion of his evenings demonstrating the mechanical rowing machine and the electric camel and the stationary bicycles to a rotating cast of passengers, some genuinely interested in fitness, many more simply curious to try a novelty they had read about in advance and wanted to experience for themselves before dinner or after it. He kept a photograph album, by several accounts, documenting passengers who used his equipment, a small informal record of the ship's more athletically inclined first-class travelers captured mid-stride on a stationary bicycle or mid-row on the rowing machine, images that in retrospect carry a particular poignancy few of the people photographed could possibly have anticipated at the time, though of course to them in the moment it was simply a bit of shipboard fun, a novelty photograph to send home to friends who would never quite believe a passenger ship carried such things. Late evening use of the gymnasium was lighter than daytime use, understandably, most passengers preferring cards or conversation to exercise after a heavy dinner, but a handful of the more restless or health-conscious travelers still made their way there some nights, and the instructor, whatever his own private exhaustion after a long day, greeted each one with the same steady enthusiasm he had greeted his very first visitor that morning, because that consistency, we have talked about this before regarding other kinds of service work, was itself the actual product being purchased, regardless of what specific activity happened to be occurring in any given room. The squash racket court, one deck below the gymnasium, saw somewhat less late evening use, being a genuinely strenuous activity poorly suited to a stomach full of 10 courses and several glasses of wine, though a small number of younger, more athletically inclined men did occasionally book the court for an hour after dinner, working off some of the evening's excess through an actual physical game, rather than the more sedentary pleasures of cards and cigars favoured by their older counterparts in the smoking room above. A professional racket instructor stood ready most evenings to offer a game to any passenger wanting one, a role that combined genuine athletic skill with the same practiced social invisibility required of nearly every service position aboard, since a good instructor understood implicitly that his job was to let a wealthy amateur feel, by the end of an hour on court, considerably better at the game than the instructor's own restrained, careful play had actually allowed him to be. Wine deserves one more specific mention here, because the ship's cellars carried several genuinely notable labels that history has actually preserved some record of, champagne from the mum and hide-sick houses among them, wines that would have been entirely familiar and entirely appropriate to the tables of the wealthiest families in London, Paris and New York alike, since one of the quiet functions of a wine list this considered was to reassure the most demanding palates aboard that nothing about crossing an ocean required any actual compromise in the standard of their evening. A bottle opened at one table might be recognized, by name, by a guest at an entirely different table across the room, a small silent signal of shared taste and shared world that needed no further conversation to register. I mentioned the grand staircase only briefly at the very start of tonight's story, deliberately, because I wanted to show you the quieter corners of this ship before returning to its most famous room, and I think we can afford a few minutes there now, late as it is, since even the grand staircase had its own particular evening character worth understanding properly. The clock mounted above the staircase's uppermost landing was carved with an allegorical figure the crew and passengers alike had taken to calling honour and glory crowning time, an ornate bronze relief that most passengers walked past a dozen times a day without any longer consciously seeing it, the way any sufficiently familiar grand object eventually recedes into simple background architecture. In the evening, though, under the room's electric light filtering down through the glass dome above, that clock caught the light in a way it simply did not during the day, and more than one passenger, dressed for dinner and pausing at the top of the stairs for a moment before making their entrance, mentioned in letters home how genuinely beautiful the whole space looked by evening light specifically, warmer and richer than its daytime version, the oak paneling glowing rather than merely gleaming. The staircase itself functioned, every single evening, as a kind of informal stage, whether the passengers descending it fully admitted this to themselves or not. Arriving at dinner meant, for most first-class passengers, a deliberate pause at the top of those stairs, a moment to be seen making an entrance rather than simply walking into the dining saloon through some side passage, and the practiced ease with which the wealthiest and most socially confident passengers aboard managed that small daily performance, gown trailing just so, pace unhurried, a slight pause at the landing, as though naturally admiring the room rather than allowing herself to be admired by it, was itself a skill, cultivated over years of exactly this kind of formal entrance in exactly this kind of room, back on land, at balls and dinners and receptions, stretching back to each woman's very first season. There was a second, smaller cafe aboard as well, the Veranda Cafe, separate from the Café Parisien we visited earlier, a bright, plant-filled space with proper wicker furniture and large windows, more associated with daytime tea service than evening entertainment, though it did see some late use on the warmer of the crossing's evenings, from passengers wanting a lighter, quieter space than the smoking room or the reception room offered, a cup of tea or a light drink taken among ferns and wicker chairs, while the rest of the ship's evening carried on more loudly elsewhere. A great many of these passengers were, in fact, returning home from precisely the kind of extended European travel that wealthy Americans of this era considered almost obligatory, months spent in Paris and London and often Italy as well, visiting museums and ordering wardrobes, and, for the unmarried daughters among them, being formally presented at whatever social occasions their families could arrange access to, before the entire party turned back toward New York in time for the American social season that traditionally began in earnest each spring. This crossing, in other words, was not simply a pleasant voyage for most of these families. It was the concluding chapter of a much longer, carefully planned social campaign, months in the making, and the ship carrying them home was in its own way simply the final and most luxurious leg of that much larger undertaking. The library's actual shelves, when I mentioned them earlier, held a fairly predictable mix for a ship of this era and this clientele: popular novels of the day, a fair amount of travel writing, some history, very little that could be called genuinely challenging reading, since a ship's library existed to provide pleasant diversion rather than serious intellectual engagement, and the White Star Line's own selections reflected that purpose with real consistency. A passenger looking for something more demanding than the library offered would more likely have brought her own reading from home, tucked into a trunk alongside the gowns and the jewelry cases, a private indulgence carried across the ocean specifically because she suspected, correctly, that the ship's own shelves would not quite satisfy her. I want to say a little more about the servants who travelled with these wealthy families, because they occupied one of the stranger positions aboard this entire ship, present in first-class life every single hour of the day and evening, and yet not quite belonging to first class themselves in any official sense at all. Ladies' maids and valets accompanying their employers typically travelled on second-class tickets, or in some cases in designated servant quarters set aside specifically for exactly this purpose, close enough to first class to be summoned within minutes at any hour, distant enough in official status that they dined separately, in their own smaller mess rooms, on a schedule built entirely around their employer's needs rather than any independent rhythm of their own. This meant that a lady's maid like the fictional Bridget we followed earlier tonight, or any of the dozens of real women performing exactly that role aboard this actual ship, experienced the crossing as an almost entirely different journey than the one her employer was having, one measured not in dinners and card games and moonlit walks along the promenade, but in a continuous, attentive readiness, always positioned near enough to be useful, always slightly apart from the glittering evening she nonetheless helped produce every single night. Some employers treated their maids and valets with genuine warmth and consideration. Others treated them as something closer to particularly reliable furniture. Both kinds of relationships existed aboard this ship in roughly the same proportion they existed everywhere else in this era's wealthy households, and the women and men performing this work understood, without needing it explained, exactly which category their own particular employer fell into. Let me return, one more time, to a few of the real families we have touched on tonight, because a little more specific, verified detail helps round out the picture without turning this into a recitation of names. The Widener family, the hosts of that final evening's dinner party we described earlier, were themselves an enormously wealthy Philadelphia family who had built their fortunes substantially in streetcar transit systems and had, by 1912, become significant patrons of the arts, with a private art collection genuinely important enough that portions of it remain, to this day, part of a major American museum's permanent holdings. Colonel Astor's own family fortune, traced back generations, originally built on fur trading and later on New York real estate, a fortune old enough by 1912 to carry a certain unquestioned social authority that newer fortunes, however large, still could not quite match in the private, unspoken rankings these passengers all silently maintained of one another. None of them, sitting at dinner those 4 evenings, dressing carefully each night, ordering wine and discussing steel prices and admiring each other's jewelry, had the faintest sense that any of this would ever be remembered by anyone beyond their own immediate social circle. That is, I think, worth sitting with for a moment as we move toward the close of tonight's story. Every ordinary lovely evening any of us has ever had felt, while it was happening, exactly this unremarkable, exactly this certain to simply continue on into an unremarkable tomorrow. These evenings are only remarkable to us now in hindsight, and it would be a genuine disservice to the people who actually lived them to picture them as anything other than exactly what they felt like from the inside, which is to say simply an unusually pleasant week. I want to tell you about the musicians themselves for a moment, the actual men playing that quintet and that trio each evening, because we spent time earlier on the music they produced, without spending much time on who they actually were, and I think that omission is worth correcting before we close tonight's story. These were professional musicians, hired not directly by the White Star Line, but through an agency that supplied musical entertainment to several major shipping lines, experienced players who had performed this same repertoire on this same kind of ship many times before. Men who understood their job with real professional clarity to provide pleasant, unobtrusive atmosphere rather than genuine artistic performance, and who took real pride, in their own quiet way, in doing that specific and somewhat thankless job extremely well. They ate separately from the first-class passengers they entertained each evening, of course in their own quarters, and moved through this glittering world in a position not unlike the ladies' maids and valets we discussed a moment ago, present at the very center of first-class social life every single night, and yet fundamentally apart from it. Working musicians earning a working wage for providing the soundtrack to an evening of wealth they themselves were not remotely part of. I find myself thinking, sometimes, about what these particular men actually thought of the passengers they played for each night. 4 or 5 hours of waltzes and light classical pieces performed for an audience that mostly never looked at them directly at all, the music functioning, as we said earlier, almost as wallpaper, present and necessary, and almost entirely unnoticed by the very people it was working hardest to please. The ship's daily program, distributed each morning alongside the small printed newspaper, laid out the coming day's scheduled activities and services in the same calm, organized language a fine hotel might use. Meal times, the hours the various public rooms would be staffed and available, any special events planned for that particular evening. Passengers consulted this small printed sheet with a casualness that belied how much careful planning actually went into producing it, since coordinating meals, entertainment, and staff scheduling for hundreds of demanding first-class passengers required a level of logistical precision that most of those same passengers never once paused to consider, precisely because that invisibility of effort was, again, the entire product being sold. Card games beyond bridge circulated through these evenings too, whist among some of the older, more traditional players who had never quite adopted bridge's newer conventions. Patience played solitaire style, by passengers wanting quiet occupation rather than social competition, occasionally a livelier game of some kind breaking out among a younger group who had decided, an hour or two into the evening, that the more sedate pace of the older passengers around them simply would not do for their own particular mood that night. Deck chairs, empty by this late hour, lined the promenade in neat rows, each one technically assigned for the crossing to a specific passenger through a small ticketing system, though by evening almost nobody bothered enforcing that assignment with any real strictness, the chairs simply sitting there in the cold and the dark, canvas slightly damp with the night air, waiting for whichever early riser might claim one again in a few hours once the sun returned, and the whole cycle of shipboard leisure began again for another day. Let me introduce one more woman before we finally let this evening settle all the way down into rest. An older one this time, because the crossing looked different again, through eyes that had made this same Atlantic passage many times before, on many different ships, across several decades of considerable privilege. Call her Margaret, 71 years old, a widow of considerable independent means, making this particular crossing largely because she has always found the sea genuinely restorative and has never much cared for the fuss her adult children make whenever she travels alone, which she has done, quite happily, for the better part of 20 years now. She remembers ships considerably less grand than this one, crossings in the 1880s that took nearly twice as long and offered a fraction of this vessel's comfort, and she finds herself, at dinner most nights, quietly comparing this extraordinary ship against those older memories in a way none of the younger passengers around her, who have never known anything but this level of comfort, could possibly understand or appreciate in quite the same way. She dines lightly by choice now, 3 courses rather than 10, a habit formed less from any dietary necessity than from decades of experience teaching her exactly how much rich food she can actually enjoy before the pleasure tips over into mere excess. She retires early most nights, generally before 10, preferring an hour of quiet reading in her own stateroom to the later, livelier hours the younger set favours in the reception room and the café. But she makes a point, every single evening regardless of how tired she feels, of taking one slow turn along the covered promenade before bed, a habit she credits, with a dry humour her closest friends find genuinely funny, for her own remarkably good health at an age when most of her contemporaries have already become considerably more fragile. Maybe you recognise a little of yourself in Margaret, if you are honest. That particular pleasure of having lived through enough versions of a thing to actually appreciate, rather than simply take for granted, how remarkable its current version has become. That quiet confidence in your own preferences after decades of learning exactly what you do and do not actually enjoy, regardless of what anyone younger and more easily impressed around you seems to think you should be doing instead. Her stewardess this crossing, a woman perhaps 35 years old who has served this particular corridor of staterooms for several previous voyages now, and has come to know Margaret's specific preferences with real familiarity, brings her, unasked, a small pot of chamomile tea most evenings around 9, precisely the ritual Margaret has quietly established as her own without ever formally requesting it, simply through consistent behaviour repeated often enough that the ship's staff learnt to anticipate it on their own, which is, I think, one of the quieter true luxuries available to a passenger wealthy enough and experienced enough to have earned this kind of remembered, personalised service, not through any single large request, but through the accumulated weight of many small consistent evenings, each one teaching the people caring for her a little more about exactly who she is and precisely what she wants, without ever having to ask twice. There is a particular sweetness to the coffee service that closed nearly every one of these dinners, and I want to give it its own brief moment before we move toward closing tonight properly, because small closing rituals like this one carry a weight disproportionate to how simple they actually are. Coffee arrived strong and dark, poured from silver pots the stewards kept constantly refilled, alongside a small selection of confections, delicate French pastries mostly, petit fours iced in pale colours, small enough to be eaten in 2 bites without any risk of spoiling a lady's gloves or a gentleman's careful composure. This was the moment, more than any other in the entire evening, when conversation genuinely slowed and softened, the heavier courses behind everyone now, the evening's remaining hours stretching ahead unhurried, nothing left to accomplish except simply enjoying whatever company happened to be gathered around whichever particular table. Not every evening aboard passed in pure comfort, and it is worth acknowledging honestly that seasickness, though genuinely rare on a ship this size and this stable, still occasionally afflicted even the wealthiest passengers, particularly during the crossing's first day or so before sea legs properly settled in. A stewardess attending to a passenger feeling genuinely unwell handled the situation with the same practiced, unhurried competence she brought to every other request. A basin discreetly positioned, a cool cloth for the forehead, a quiet suggestion that fresh air on deck might help more than staying below, delivered without a trace of the mild embarrassment the passenger herself likely felt at needing this particular kind of help at all, since even discomfort aboard a ship built around this level of service was met with the same calm professional grace as everything else. By midnight most nights, the great public rooms of first class had thinned considerably, the dining saloon dark and empty now, its tables already cleared and reset for tomorrow's breakfast by a night crew of stewards working quickly and quietly, while the passengers who had eaten their hours earlier slept soundly several decks above. The reception room's chairs sat empty, cushions still faintly holding the shape of whoever had last occupied them. The smoking room held on longest, as it always did, a handful of the most committed late-night players still at their cards. The fire behind its brass surround burned down now to a low steady glow rather than the fuller blaze of earlier in the evening. The room considerably quieter, conversation dropped to something closer to a murmur out of a general unspoken agreement that the hour called for it. The corridors themselves, by this point, carried almost no sound at all beyond the ship's own constant low mechanical hum. That same engine note that had been present, felt more than heard, underneath every single moment of this entire elaborate evening in the dining saloon and the smoking room and the reading room and every private stateroom alike. The one genuinely unifying sensation shared equally by the wealthiest passenger aboard and the humblest member of the crew keeping that engine running through the night, a sound so constant that by the fourth evening of the crossing, almost nobody aboard consciously heard it anymore at all, the way you eventually stop hearing your own heartbeat, present and essential and entirely beneath your notice. I want to mention the ship's purser for a moment, because his office played a quiet but genuinely important role in these wealthy passengers' evenings that rarely gets any attention at all. Many of the most valuable pieces of jewelry aboard, the diamond necklaces and pearl ropes we discussed earlier, were not actually kept in passengers' own staterooms overnight at all, but deposited each evening after dinner in the ship's purser's safe, a genuine security measure most first-class passengers took entirely for granted as simply how a crossing of this caliber was supposed to work. A woman finishing her evening might hand her jewelry case to a steward before retiring, trusting it would be safely locked away until morning, and collect it again the following evening before dressing for dinner. This small daily exchange happening with such practiced routine that it barely registered to the passengers themselves as anything worth remarking on at all. That purser's office also handled the enormous volume of correspondence and telegrams passing between passengers and the world waiting for them in New York, coordinating with the wireless room to ensure urgent messages reached their intended recipients promptly, managing the small mountain of outgoing mail that would be sorted and dispatched the moment the ship reached port. Several wealthy families aboard had already sent word ahead confirming their expected arrival, and in some cases arranging elaborate homecoming receptions, dinners and gatherings planned for the very evening the ship was due to dock, an entire second layer of anticipated celebration already taking shape in New York, even while the crossing itself continued. There is something worth noticing in that too, the way even this extraordinary self-contained floating world of first-class luxury was never actually separate from the ordinary lives waiting on either end of the voyage. Every passenger aboard, however wealthy, however thoroughly entertained by 10-course dinners and orchestra music and elaborate jewelry, was still, underneath all of it, simply a person travelling home or travelling away from home, carrying the same ordinary hopes and small anxieties about family and business and the specific shape of the life waiting for them once this beautiful temporary interruption finally ended. Let me bring you back, before we close, to the woman we met at the very beginning of tonight's story, sitting alone at her small writing desk in her B-deck stateroom, the letter to her sister still unwritten. It is later now, past 11, and she has finally set pen to paper. Only a few lines in the end, nothing elaborate, a brief description of the crossing so far, the extraordinary size of the ship, a small joke about her husband's cards, an offhand mention of the remarkably clear stars she noticed on the promenade deck earlier that evening. She seals the envelope, sets it on the small table by the door for the steward to collect in the morning, and allows herself, finally, the particular satisfaction of a small task completed after several days of quietly meaning to get to it. She undresses without calling for her maid tonight. A small private indulgence she allows herself perhaps once a crossing, unhooking her own gown slowly in the low lamplight, taking her own time about it in a way that feels, after 4 days of being dressed and undressed and arranged by someone else's careful hands, genuinely restful in its own right. The nightgown she pulls on is soft, worn thin and comfortable from years of use, the one item in her considerable luggage that has nothing whatsoever to do with impressing anyone, chosen purely for how it feels against her skin at the end of a long full day. Picture, for a moment, the entire first-class section of this ship at once, all of it, every stateroom we have visited tonight, and dozens more we have not had time for, each one settling towards sleep on its own, slightly different schedule, but all of them, by 1 in the morning, moving in roughly the same direction. Eleanor asleep beside her husband, the small travel diary closed on her nightstand, Henry a few decks away, his novel finally set down half-finished, the reading lamp switched off sometime past midnight, Margaret, who retired hours ago by her own long-established habit, sleeping the deep, satisfied sleep of a woman who took her evening walk exactly as she always does and has never once regretted the discipline of it. The young couple from the railing, each in their own separate stateroom now, both privately turning over the same conversation in their minds before sleep finally claims them, neither one aware the other is doing exactly the same thing at exactly the same hour. The beds themselves, across every one of these staterooms, shared a common quality worth mentioning, since the White Star Line had invested considerably in the actual physical comfort of first-class sleeping arrangements, understanding correctly that a passenger's overall impression of the crossing depended enormously on how well she actually slept each night, regardless of how splendid her dinner had been. Linens were fine cotton, changed daily, blankets genuinely warm wool, rather than the thinner coverings found in lower classes, mattresses considerably more substantial than the built-in bunks common on older or less expensive vessels. The passenger climbing into bed after an evening like the ones we have spent tonight exploring found, waiting for her, a genuinely comfortable place to rest, not merely an adequate one, the comfort itself extending all the way down into details most passengers never consciously registered and simply, gratefully, experienced. High above all of this, on the ship's open bridge, a considerably smaller and quieter world carried on its own steady nighttime rhythm, officers standing their watches in the cold night air in careful rotation, eyes on the dark water ahead, the ship's compass and instruments the only company through the long, uneventful hours of a calm crossing. This was, in its own way, the most essential work happening anywhere aboard this entire vessel, and also the least visible to the passengers whose comfort it made possible, a handful of men standing quietly in the cold so that several hundred others could sleep, undisturbed, in warmth and comfort several decks below, never once needing to think about the steady, careful attention keeping their entire floating world safely moving through the dark. I think there is something genuinely worth carrying with you into your own sleep tonight, in that image. Somewhere, always, someone is keeping careful watch so that someone else can rest easy. It was true on this ship in April of 1912, and in its own quieter way, it remains true almost everywhere, in almost every life, even now. Let me tell you about one more man before we finish, because his relationship to all of this luxury looked genuinely different from Henry's, or from Colonel Astor's inherited ease, and I think that difference matters. Call him Walter, 52, a man who built his own fortune from almost nothing, starting in a small Midwestern hardware business 4 decades ago and expanding it through a combination of genuine shrewdness and considerable luck into a manufacturing concern now employing several thousand people across 3 states. He is traveling first class tonight, and every single evening of this crossing with a kind of quiet, private disbelief that has never fully worn off, not even after a decade of being wealthy enough to afford exactly this, where Colonel Astor moves through the dining saloon with the unthinking ease of a man who has never known any other way of being looked at. Walter still, 4 decades into his own considerable success, feels a small flicker of something like vigilance every time he enters one of these grand rooms, a residual instinct from years spent watching other men's reactions closely, reading a room for danger or opportunity, a habit built during decades of hard negotiation that simple wealth alone has never fully erased. He orders his wine carefully, having taught himself, through considerable private study over the years, exactly which vintages a man of his current position is expected to know and prefer, a knowledge Astor's grandfather would have absorbed unconsciously in childhood, and that Walter has had to learn, deliberately, the way a person learns a second language later in life, fluent now, but never quite forgetting the effort the fluency required. Maybe you recognize something of Walter in yourself, or in someone you love, that particular mixture of genuine, hard-won pride and a small persistent worry that somehow, despite every objective measure of success, you still do not quite belong in the room you have worked your entire life to reach. I think it is worth saying plainly that this feeling, whatever era produces it, however much wealth eventually surrounds it, rarely disappears entirely, and that even aboard the most luxurious ship ever built, at the most exclusive tables it offered, a considerable number of the people dining there were quietly carrying exactly this same small private uncertainty underneath their perfectly composed evening manners. Walter dines well tonight, enjoys his wine, tells a story at his own table about the early years of his business that gets a genuinely warm laugh from everyone listening, and retires, eventually, to a stateroom every bit as fine as Colonel Astor's own, feeling, by the time he finally falls asleep, something close to actual peace, the particular satisfaction of a man who built every single thing currently surrounding him with his own 2 hands and his own considerable will, and who has, on this particular crossing, on this particular ship, finally allowed himself, just for tonight, to simply enjoy it without the usual undercurrent of vigilance running beneath the enjoyment. The ship itself, the vessel carrying all of these people, and all of their varied private relationships to the luxury surrounding them, existed within its own larger context worth understanding briefly. White Star Line had built the Titanic and her sister ships specifically to compete with rival Cunard Line's Lusitania and Mauretania, vessels that had claimed considerable speed records in preceding years. White Star's answer was not to chase raw speed, but to compete instead on sheer scale and comfort, building the largest and most luxuriously appointed ships afloat rather than the fastest, a deliberate strategic choice that shaped literally every decision we have discussed tonight, from the size of the dining saloon to the existence of the a la carte restaurant to the private promenade decks attached to the grandest suites. Every single luxury these wealthy passengers enjoyed across these 4 evenings existed, at some level, because a shipping company had made a calculated business decision that comfort, not speed, would be what convinced the wealthiest travelers in the world to choose this particular line over its closest rival. Let me slow all the way down now and simply describe, without much further explanation, a few more small sensory pieces of these evenings, because I think there is real pleasure, at this hour, in simply picturing things rather than being told what they mean. The particular sound of ice being cracked and settled into a silver bowl before the oysters arrived, a small bright clatter cutting briefly through the low murmur of conversation, the warmth of candlelight against white linen, dozens of small flames throughout the dining saloon multiplying and softening under the crystal fixtures overhead until the whole room seemed to glow from some source no one could quite locate. The particular resistance of a cork easing free from a champagne bottle, that small satisfying pop absorbed almost instantly into the room's larger noise, followed by the quiet hiss of pouring, the weight of a heavy damask napkin settling across a lap, the faint sweetness of hothouse flowers arranged at the center of every table, roses and lilies grown specifically for occasions exactly like this one, and carried aboard in the ship's cold storage, their fragrance mixing, by the 2nd or 3rd course, with roasted meat and warm bread and the particular mineral smell of good champagne. Dessert brought its own small theatre each night, a tray of confections arranged with real artistry, spun sugar occasionally used for the more elaborate presentations, a chef's particular pride on full display in these final sweet courses even after hours of relentless kitchen labor already behind him, a woman's small exclamation of delight at a particularly beautiful presentation, genuine rather than performed, the kind of pure, uncomplicated pleasure that even considerable wealth and considerable sophistication never quite manages to dull entirely. I want to tell you about a mother and daughter for a moment, because their particular evening carried its own specific texture worth including here. The mother, watching her 19-year-old daughter across the dinner table, with the particular mixture of pride and anxious calculation that mothers of this era brought to exactly this stage of a daughter's life, privately assessing, throughout the entire meal, which of the young men at nearby tables seemed most promising, which conversations her daughter handled with real grace, and which revealed a nervousness still not fully outgrown. The daughter herself, aware of being watched in exactly this way, and mostly, by now, unbothered by it, having grown up entirely inside a world where evenings like this one functioned simultaneously as pure pleasure and as something closer to a job interview for the rest of her life, moved through her own evening with a practiced ease that occasionally slipped, just slightly, into something more genuinely her own, a real laugh at something actually funny rather than merely charming, a moment of real curiosity about a subject the young man beside her raised that had nothing whatsoever to do with courtship calculations. Her mother noticed that slip, and rather than correcting it, found herself smiling instead, remembering faintly her own younger self at exactly this kind of table, exactly this kind of evening, decades ago now, the particular relief of occasionally forgetting to perform and simply, briefly, being present instead. Somewhere in the society pages of several major newspapers back in New York, the passenger manifest of this very crossing had already been noted with interest. Prominent names listed among the first-class travelers expected to arrive within days, a small preview of exactly the kind of public attention several of these families lived with constantly, their movements, their gowns, their social calendars considered legitimate subjects of public interest by readers who would never meet them and knew them only through exactly this kind of printed notice. Being watched in this way, at a distance, by strangers who felt they knew you through newsprint alone, was simply one more ordinary condition of the wealth these particular passengers carried, no more remarkable to them, by this point in their lives, than the engine's steady hum running beneath every room we have visited tonight. Let me describe one of the finer staterooms a little more fully, because we touched on the grand parlour suites earlier only briefly, and I think the specific furnishings deserve a slower look. A suite finished in the Louis XVI style carried delicate carved and gilded furniture, pale silk upholstery, a marble mantel around a fireplace that, unlike the coal fire in the smoking room, was purely electric, designed to mimic the warm flicker of real flame without any of the associated risk aboard a ship built almost entirely of steel. Empire-style suites leaned instead toward a more masculine formality, deep mahogany, brass fittings, a restrained color palette drawn from the actual historical Napoleonic period the style referenced, chosen by whichever passenger's own taste ran toward that particular kind of grandeur, rather than the lighter French Rococo alternative available just a few doors down the same corridor. Private bathrooms, where a suite included one, represented a genuine novelty most passengers, even wealthy ones, had not necessarily enjoyed on every previous crossing of their lives. Hot and cold running water on demand, a proper enamel bathtub rather than a portable basin carried in by a steward, tiled walls that stayed dry and clean despite the ship's constant gentle motion, a passenger accustomed to grand hotels on land found here, at sea, a standard of private bathing facility that matched or in some cases exceeded what she enjoyed even at home, a fact several passengers specifically remarked on in letters, genuinely surprised that a ship, of all things, could offer plumbing this refined. I want to describe one more family relationship before we finally let this evening rest. A father and his adult son this time, because business and inheritance moved through these dinners in their own particular current worth naming. The father, 63, has spent this entire crossing gradually, deliberately, handing pieces of genuine business authority to his 34-year-old son. Small decisions at first, which wine to select, which acquaintance to cultivate over dinner, And now, by this final evening, something considerably larger, an actual negotiating position on a deal the son will need to manage largely on his own once they reach New York. Their conversation over dinner tonight moves between genuine warmth and something more careful, a father testing, gently and without ever quite admitting he is testing, whether his son has actually absorbed everything he has spent 30 years trying to teach him, a son aware of being tested and choosing, mostly, to simply demonstrate his competence rather than protest the ongoing evaluation, since he has learned, over many years, that protesting only prolongs it. There is real love underneath this particular evening's careful negotiation, the specific, somewhat formal love common between fathers and sons of this class and this era, expressed less through open affection than through the son's steady attention to every lesson his father has ever offered him, and the father's genuine, if rarely stated, pride in watching his son rise to meet it. Fresh flowers appeared throughout the ship's public rooms every single day of the crossing, an enormous ongoing floral operation managed by dedicated stewards specifically trained for this purpose. Orchids and roses and lilies kept fresh in the ship's cold storage and arranged fresh each morning for that day's meals and gatherings, a detail so seamlessly maintained that almost no passenger aboard ever paused to wonder how, precisely, a ship in the middle of the North Atlantic managed to keep fresh-cut flowers looking perfect on every single table for 4 consecutive days running. Coffee served after dinner came from beans the ship's kitchens roasted and ground fresh each day, rather than relying on any pre-prepared supply, a small detail of genuine culinary seriousness that distinguished the very finest hospitality of this era from merely good hospitality. The difference between coffee that had simply been kept warm and coffee that had been prepared, specifically and freshly, for the exact moment it would be served, a distinction most passengers could not have articulated precisely but could absolutely taste every single evening, without quite knowing why this particular cup tasted so much better than the coffee waiting for them back home. A number of passengers carried personal cameras aboard, still a relatively novel item for casual travelers in 1912, and several informal photographs survive from this very crossing. Passengers posed on the promenade deck in their day clothes. A small group gathered near the gymnasium's mechanical horse laughing at something now lost entirely to history. A formal portrait taken in one of the public rooms by a passenger who happened to be a genuinely skilled amateur photographer and spent part of several evenings quietly documenting the crossing for his own private pleasure. These images, when they survive at all, carry a particular quality worth noting, an unposed, unguarded ordinariness entirely unlike the formal studio portraits wealthy families typically commissioned on land. Small candid glimpses of real people simply enjoying an evening, unaware of any audience beyond the small circle of friends who would eventually see the printed photograph. Postcards, purchased from the ship's small shop or the barber shop we mentioned earlier, gave passengers a more official kind of souvenir. Printed images of the ship itself, her grand staircase, her exterior profile at sea, purchased and written on and posted home as proof, in a sense, that this extraordinary voyage had actually happened, that the writer had genuinely stood in these rooms and eaten these meals, and was not merely describing something imagined or exaggerated for effect. Let me tell you about a brother and sister travelling together this crossing, because their particular evening carried a warmth distinct from the marriages and courtships and business relationships we have spent most of tonight exploring. She is 26, unmarried by her own considered choice rather than any lack of opportunity, independent-minded in a way her extended family finds alternately admirable and faintly exhausting. He is 29, recently divorced, a fact still spoken of only in careful, lowered tones among the wider family, travelling with his sister partly for genuine companionship and partly because she, more than anyone else in their family, has simply refused to treat his divorce as a scandal, requiring careful management rather than an ordinary, difficult thing that sometimes happens to ordinary people. Their dinners together this crossing have been, by both their private accounts, some of the easiest evenings either of them has spent in months. Real conversation rather than careful performance, actual laughter rather than the polite social version either of them might produce for a table of relative strangers. Tonight, their final evening together before the ship reaches New York and their separate lives reclaim them, they linger particularly long at the table after dessert, in no hurry at all to move toward the smoking room or the reading room or anywhere else, simply enjoying, for a little longer, the specific rare pleasure of a sibling's genuinely easy company. I want to mention the reputation this ship carried, briefly, because it shaped how safely and how easily every single passenger we have followed tonight actually slept each evening. The Titanic had been widely discussed, in the months before this crossing, as among the safest vessels ever constructed, her design incorporating a system of watertight compartments that popular press coverage had described, with more confidence than strict engineering accuracy actually supported, as making the ship essentially unsinkable. Whatever the precise truth of that reputation, and history would eventually complicate it considerably, it functioned for every passenger dressing for dinner and dancing and playing cards and finally climbing into bed across these 4 evenings as a genuine and entirely sincere source of comfort. One more reason among many why sleep came easily each night. The ship itself, in the minds of the people it carried, simply too large, too well built, too thoroughly modern to represent any real cause for concern. Picture the ship from a distance for a moment, the way almost none of the passengers we have followed tonight ever actually saw her, since seeing your own ship from outside required, on a crossing like this one, being on some entirely different vessel altogether. Hundreds of portholes and windows glowing warm yellow against the black water and the black sky. The whole vast structure lit from within like some enormous floating hotel improbably transplanted into open ocean, visible for miles in every direction, on a clear night like the ones this particular crossing enjoyed. A beacon of pure engineered light moving steadily westward through water so dark and so cold it would have been almost impossible from any distance to tell exactly where the ship's own reflected light ended and the star-filled sky above it actually began. Any other vessel crossing paths with the Titanic on one of these nights would have seen, from far off, this same extraordinary sight, a small floating city fully illuminated, orchestra music, and the murmur of hundreds of dinner conversations entirely inaudible across that distance, of course, but the light itself carrying, even from miles away, some clear, unmistakable sense of the sheer scale and confidence of the vessel producing it. I find something worth sitting with in that image. This whole elaborate evening we have spent so long exploring from the inside, the dinners and the cards and the jewelry and the careful social calculations, reduced, from any real distance, to simply light on water, warm and steady and entirely indifferent to how it might actually appear to whatever unseen observer happened to be watching. The wireless room, several decks up near the bridge, carried on its own quiet work through even the latest hours of the night, one operator generally on duty while the other rested, managing the steady flow of commercial and personal messages that never entirely stopped moving through the ship's equipment, regardless of the hour, since somewhere across the vast distances that wireless signal could reach, it was always some other hour entirely, morning in one place, afternoon in another, and messages arrived accordingly, without any real regard for how late it had grown aboard the ship itself. The operators worked this demanding, oddly solitary job with real dedication, aware in a general professional sense of their own genuine importance to the ship's operation, without necessarily dwelling on it much themselves, since to them, most nights, this was simply their job, performed competently and without much drama, exactly the way most difficult and essential work actually gets done in the world, quietly, by people who rarely receive much credit for doing it well. By 2 in the morning on most nights of this crossing, the ship had settled into something close to complete stillness above decks, the smoking room finally empty, the last committed card players having finally, reluctantly, called it a night, stewards moving through darkened corridors on their own quiet rounds, checking that everything remained properly in order for the morning ahead. The cold continued outside, sharper now than it had been even a few hours earlier, the temperature dropping steadily as the ship moved further west and further north into colder water, a fact the crew on watch noted with professional attention, and the sleeping passengers below, wrapped in warm wool blankets in electrically heated staterooms, never had any reason to notice at all. The ship carried its own physician, a proper doctor with a small dedicated hospital space aboard, attending mostly to minor complaints across a crossing of this length, seasickness in the earlier days, the occasional minor injury, the kind of small ailments any large temporary community inevitably produces, simply through the ordinary mathematics of enough people spending enough hours together. For first-class passengers specifically, a house call from the ship's physician carried the same discreet, unhurried quality as every other service aboard, the doctor arriving at a stateroom door within minutes of being summoned, examining whatever complaint a passenger presented with genuine professional attention, and departing again with a quiet reassurance that, more often than not, proved entirely sufficient on its own to settle whatever anxiety had prompted the call in the first place. There is a particular luxury worth naming plainly before we finally let this evening rest, one that runs underneath every single scene we have explored tonight, without ever being fully named until now. It is not the 10 courses, or the champagne, or the private promenade decks, or the jewelry locked each night in the purser's safe. It is simply this. For 4 full evenings, several hundred extraordinarily fortunate people were released, almost entirely, from the accumulated weight of daily necessity that shapes most human evenings, most human lives. No meal to plan or prepare, no fire to lay, no child to settle beyond what a nurse or governess had already handled, no worry, for these particular few days, about tomorrow's obligations beyond which gown to select and which acquaintance to seek out over cards. That kind of total release from ordinary necessity is, when you actually sit with it, an almost unimaginably rare condition, available across the whole of human history to only the smallest fraction of people who have ever lived, and even then, usually only for these brief, temporary, deliberately constructed windows, rather than as any permanent condition of daily existence. Even Colonel Astor, even the Wideners, even every genuinely wealthy family we have followed tonight, returned, once this ship reached New York, to lives that still contained their own share of genuine worry and genuine obligation, business concerns and family concerns, and the ordinary human weight that money, however considerable, has never actually managed to fully dissolve for anyone. But for these 4 evenings specifically, suspended in the middle of an ocean, moving steadily toward a destination that could wait a few days longer without any real consequence, that weight lifted almost entirely for nearly everyone we have spent tonight following. And I think there is something worth borrowing from that, something worth carrying gently into your own rest tonight, regardless of how far your own circumstances sit from a first-class stateroom on the most luxurious ship of its era. The permission, just for these next several minutes, to set down whatever you have been carrying today. The dishes still in the sink, the email you have been meaning to answer, the small worry sitting quietly at the back of your mind that has been waiting all day for exactly this kind of stillness to finally surface. Let it wait a little longer. It will still be there tomorrow, exactly as manageable as it actually is, no larger and no more urgent than it was this afternoon, however large it might feel right now in the particular vulnerable stillness of almost sleep. On a few of these evenings, particularly the third night's especially festive full-dress dinner, informal dancing broke out in the reception room once dinner itself concluded, the small orchestra shifting from its usual background repertoire into something more clearly meant for actual dancing. Waltzes mostly, the standard and universally known dance of this entire social class, every man and woman aboard having learnt its basic steps as children, practiced and refined over years of formal dancing masters and countless previous balls back on land, watching a room full of genuinely skilled dancers move through a waltz together. Dozens of couples turning in careful synchronized circles across a polished floor, carried its own particular beauty, gowns catching the light as they turned, the whole room moving as something close to a single coordinated organism, despite each couple technically dancing independently of every other. A young woman dancing for the first time with a man she has only recently allowed herself to genuinely like might find, in the specific close physical coordination a waltz requires, a kind of permitted intimacy unavailable almost anywhere else in this careful, chaperoned social world. Hands touching, bodies moving in close practiced rhythm, an entire evening's worth of careful, restrained flirtation suddenly given actual physical expression within the fully sanctioned, entirely respectable bounds of a formal dance. After dinner liqueurs offered their own small final flourish to these evenings, cognac and port most commonly for the men retiring toward the smoking room, something sweeter, perhaps a small glass of Grand Marnier or a light dessert wine, for the women lingering a little longer in the reception room, before eventually making their own way toward bed. These small glasses, sipped slowly over the final quarter hour or so of formal socializing, functioned as their own gentle signal that the evening's more structured portion had genuinely concluded now, whatever came next, cards or conversation, or simply retiring, existing in a looser, less formally choreographed register than everything that had come before it. And now I think we have followed this particular evening, and these particular 4 evenings, about as far and as fully as they deserve to be followed tonight. The dinners have ended, the cards have been played and mostly forgotten by morning. The dancing has stopped, the orchestra packed away their instruments hours ago now. The smoking room's fire has burnt down to embers, and one by one, room by room, deck by deck, this entire glittering temporary world has settled, finally, into rest. Before we let the night finish settling all the way, I want to linger a little longer over a few more small, ordinary pictures from these evenings, because there is comfort, I think, in simply staying a while longer inside a warm and gentle scene rather than rushing toward its close. Think of the stateroom stewards working their final rounds of the night, checking each darkened corridor with a small electric lantern, noting quietly which doors remain lit from within, a passenger still reading, still writing, still awake past the hour when most of the ship has already surrendered to sleep, and which doors have gone dark hours ago, their occupants long since settled. There is a kind of tenderness in that quiet checking, a final small act of care extended to hundreds of sleeping strangers by people whose own night has not yet ended, whose own rest waits several more hours down the line, after every other passenger's comfort has been properly seen to first. Think of the kitchens, 4 decks below the dining saloon, finally quiet now after a night of relentless, exacting labor, pots and pans scrubbed and stacked, the enormous ovens cooling slowly through the small hours, ready to be relit again well before dawn for tomorrow's breakfast service. The chefs themselves, exhausted in the particular deep way that comes from standing on your feet through hours of precise, demanding work, are finally resting too, in narrow bunks in crew quarters. Most of the passengers upstairs will never once think to picture their own sleep every bit as necessary, every bit as deserved, as anyone's in any first-class stateroom above them. Think of the linen room, stacks of fresh tablecloths and napkins pressed and folded and ready for tomorrow, an entire quiet department of the ship's operation existing solely to ensure that every single table, every single evening, presents itself as though no effort at all went into its preparation. Think of the flowers, cut fresh again in a few hours for tomorrow's dinner, currently resting in the ship's cold storage in careful, dark, undisturbed silence, gathering whatever flowers gather in the dark before their own brief, beautiful evening arrives. Think of the orchestra members, their instruments cased and stowed, finally off duty themselves after a long evening of providing exactly the kind of pleasant, unnoticed atmosphere we discussed earlier, resting now in their own small shared quarters, tomorrow's repertoire already loosely planned, another evening of careful, professional invisibility waiting for them just beyond this night's rest. Think of the wireless operators, one resting while the other continues his quiet vigil, messages still occasionally arriving and being carefully logged. The small steady work of keeping this floating world connected to everything beyond it continuing on, unhurried, through even the deepest hours of the night. Think of the bridge itself, officers standing their careful watch in the sharp cold air, eyes on dark water, the ship's compass glowing softly in the darkness, the whole enormous vessel entrusted, for these quiet hours, to a small handful of steady, attentive people doing careful, unglamorous work, so that everyone else, above and below, might rest without a single worry crossing their minds. And think, finally, of the water itself, vast and dark and endlessly patient beneath all of this, beneath every story we have told tonight, every dinner and every dance and every quiet private moment at a railing under clear cold stars. The ocean does not know or care about any of the careful social architecture we have spent this evening exploring, does not know which passenger dined in the a la carte restaurant or the main saloon, which woman wore diamonds and which wore pearls, which man was born to his fortune and which built it with his own 2 hands across 4 determined decades. It simply carries the ship the way it has always carried ships, indifferent and immense and, on this particular week, remarkably calm. There is a particular stillness that settles over any large, well-run household or vessel in these final hours before dawn. A stillness distinct from the ordinary quiet of daytime. Heavier somehow, more complete, the kind of quiet that only arrives once every single person with a task to perform has finally, however briefly, set that task aside. Even a ship built specifically to never stop moving, engines turning steadily through every hour of every night without pause, finds its own version of this stillness eventually, not in the machinery itself, which never rests, but in the human world layered on top of it, room after room after room, finally going dark and quiet and still. I think about the specific weight of a good wool blanket at exactly this hour, whether aboard a ship in 1912 or in your own bed tonight. The particular comfort of enough warmth and enough weight to make a body feel genuinely held rather than merely covered. I think about the sound cold air makes against a window pane, present but distant, a reminder of a world outside your warmth that only makes the warmth itself feel more complete by comparison. I think about the last small conscious thought most people have before sleep finally claims them, rarely anything dramatic or important, usually something small and unfinished. A fragment of the day's conversation, a half-formed plan for tomorrow, drifting gently out of focus the way everything eventually drifts out of focus at exactly this hour. Somewhere aboard that ship, on any one of these 4 calm nights, a woman is falling asleep mid-thought, the sentence in her mind trailing off unfinished the way sentences do at exactly this hour, something about tomorrow's breakfast, or a dress she still needs to have properly pressed, or nothing at all really. Just the pleasant, formless drift of a mind finally released from the day's careful attention. Somewhere else, a man is already asleep entirely, his breathing slow and even, the smoking room's cigar smoke still faintly clinging to his jacket where it hangs now over the back of a chair. Tomorrow's business concerns waiting patiently for him exactly where he left them, exactly as manageable as they will still be once he actually wakes to face them. The corridors have gone entirely dark now, except for the small, steady electric sconces spaced along every wall, burning low and constant through the night, the way they burn every night, needing no attention from anyone to keep doing precisely what they were built to do. A single steward, making his final slow round of the evening, pauses for a moment near the top of the grand staircase, looking down at that same bronze clock we mentioned earlier, its allegorical figures catching what little light remains in the room, before continuing on, unhurried, toward whatever remains of his own long shift. And beneath every single one of these small, quiet, ordinary pictures, the sea itself continues exactly as it has continued for the entire crossing, vast and dark and remarkably calm, carrying this whole small floating world of dinners and dances and jewelry and quiet private hopes steadily onward through a night that asks nothing more of anyone aboard than the simple universal permission to finally, completely rest. Before we finally let the evening close, let me offer a little more of the sheer scale behind everything we have spent tonight exploring, because the actual numbers, when you sit with them properly, carry their own quiet astonishment. The ship's provisioning for this single crossing included tens of thousands of eggs, thousands of pounds of fresh meat, thousands of pounds of fish, many tons of potatoes, thousands of pounds of coffee, and champagne and wine numbering well into the thousands of bottles, all of it loaded aboard at Southampton in the days before departure, and calculated with real precision against the expected number of passengers across every class, first, second, and third alike, since even third-class passengers, whatever the enormous gap in luxury between decks, still needed to be fed 3 genuine meals a day for the length of the crossing. Second class aboard this ship, worth a brief mention here since we have spent most of tonight on the extremes of first and third, offered its own comfortable, respectable, considerably less extravagant version of shipboard life, closer in spirit to a good middle-class hotel than to either the opulence above or the more communal simplicity below. Second-class passengers dined well, 3 solid courses rather than 10, in a dining saloon considerably smaller and simpler than the first-class version, but perfectly pleasant in its own right, oak-panelled, properly served, entirely respectable. Their evenings included their own library, their own smoking room, their own promenade space, a complete and self-contained world of moderate comfort that most of its passengers, professionals and small business owners, and comfortable but not truly wealthy families, would have found entirely satisfactory, a good solid crossing without any of the elaborate performance first class required of the people living inside it. I mention this not to flatten the very real differences we have spent tonight examining, but because I think it matters to remember that this ship contained not simply two extremes, luxury and hardship, but an entire genuine spectrum of 1912 life, each level experiencing essentially the same 4 days, the same calm sea, the same clear cold stars overhead, filtered through whatever particular version of comfort their own ticket happened to purchase. Before we finally close the door on tonight's story, let me offer one last small memory, the kind that sometimes drifts up unbidden in the last few minutes before sleep, when the mind, freed from the day's more urgent business, wanders backward instead of forward. Somewhere aboard, half asleep already, a passenger finds herself thinking not of tonight's dinner, but of the morning this whole crossing began. The noise and bustle of Southampton's dock, hundreds of trunks being loaded, families calling final farewells to relatives who had come only to see them off. The ship itself rising above the dock so enormously that craning your neck to see its uppermost decks left you faintly dizzy. She remembers the particular mixture of excitement and mild nervousness she felt walking up the gangway that first morning, a feeling already, after 4 smooth and comfortable evenings, almost impossible to fully recall with any real intensity, the way any early anxiety tends to soften and blur once the thing you are anxious about has turned out, again and again, to be perfectly fine. She remembers, too, the small practical questions that occupied her in those first hours aboard, questions so thoroughly answered now by 4 days of experience that they seem almost quaint to remember at all. How generously should a passenger tip the stewards and stewardesses attending her for the length of the crossing? The custom, well established by 1912 among experienced transatlantic travellers, generally favoured a set gratuity handed personally to one's regular steward or stewardess on the final morning of the voyage, a sum calibrated carefully to the level of service received and the passenger's own means, substantial enough to properly reward genuine attentiveness across 4 days, never so extravagant as to seem like an attempt to buy affection rather than simply acknowledge good work honestly done. She had worried, that first morning, about 100 small things exactly like this: correct behaviour, correct dress, correct conduct in rooms she had never actually seen before stepping aboard. 4 evenings later, none of it feels worth worrying about anymore. She knows this ship now, or at least knows her own small corner of it well enough, knows which steward remembers her preferences without being told, knows exactly how these evenings unfold from first course to final closed door. That, I think, is its own quiet comfort worth noticing, the way even the strangest and most elaborate new experience eventually, given a few days, simply becomes familiar, becomes simply your life for a while, no longer requiring quite so much careful attention to manage. This particular final evening had followed a quieter kind of morning than most of the crossing, since earlier that same day, a Sunday, the captain himself had led a brief religious service in the first-class dining saloon, as was customary aboard ships of this line on Sundays at sea, hymns sung by several hundred voices, in a room usually filled instead with the clink of silver and the murmur of dinner conversation, prayers offered for safe passage in language every passenger present had heard recited at church services back on land more times than they could count. It was, by most accounts, a perfectly ordinary service, unremarkable in every way except for the mild novelty of holding it at sea. Hundreds of voices rising together in a room built for very different pleasures, before the day resumed its usual comfortable rhythm of lunch and cards and idle deck conversation, moving steadily on toward exactly the kind of dinner and dancing and quiet fireside cards we have spent this whole evening exploring. Down in the ship's laundry, several decks below the passengers now settling towards sleep, a night crew continued its own quiet work, washing and pressing the enormous daily volume of linen this ship required, tablecloths and napkins from tonight's dinner already soaking, tomorrow's fresh set already pressed and stacked and ready for the morning stewards to lay out precisely as they had laid out every previous morning's table. This was work that never fully stopped across the entire crossing, a continuous cycle of use and cleaning and reuse that kept every white cloth in every first-class room looking, each single evening, as though it had never once been touched by anyone before. I think of all these small, continuous, largely unnoticed labours together now. One final time before we let this whole evening finally close, the laundry and the kitchen and the flowers kept fresh in cold storage, and the chief steward's careful invisible vigilance, and the stewardess checking one last darkened corridor, all of it working in quiet, coordinated concert to produce, for several hundred fortunate passengers, 4 evenings that felt, from the inside, like the most effortless comfort imaginable. Nothing about genuine comfort, it turns out, whether aboard the grandest ship ever built, or in your own ordinary bedroom tonight, is ever quite as effortless as it feels once you are finally, fully resting inside it. There is one more room worth a brief mention before we finally close tonight's story: the ship's dark room and small photographic service, available to the handful of passengers serious enough about their hobby to want proper facilities for developing plates taken during the crossing, a genuine novelty for a passenger ship of this era, and one more small example of exactly how thoroughly this vessel had been built to anticipate every possible interest a wealthy traveller might bring aboard with her. A passenger with a genuine passion for photography could spend an hour or two of an otherwise quiet evening here, developing an image taken that afternoon on deck, watching a picture slowly emerge from blank paper under careful red light, a small private satisfaction entirely apart from the more social pleasures filling every other room we have visited tonight. The ship's kennels, situated on the boat deck, held a modest number of first-class passengers' dogs, small and large alike, cared for through the day by a dedicated attendant and visited regularly by their owners, a few of whom made a point of walking their dogs on deck each evening before retiring. One more small, quiet ritual folded into an otherwise elaborate evening, the simple, uncomplicated pleasure of a familiar animal's company at the end of a long day of careful social performance. Maybe she is a woman who finds, in those 10 quiet minutes walking her small terrier along the boat deck each night, more genuine peace than in any of the evening's more elaborate entertainments, the dog entirely unconcerned with seating charts or jewellery, or which acquaintance deserves cultivating, simply happy, simply present, simply glad of her company exactly as it is. And somewhere in among all of this, the ship's small onboard shop, tucked near the reception room, continued to offer its modest selection of sundries and small luxuries, even into the evening hours, for any passenger who had forgotten something, or simply wanted a small impulse purchase to mark the crossing: fine soaps, small leather goods, the postcards we mentioned earlier, a handful of jewellery pieces considerably more modest than anything locked in the purser's safe, but pleasant enough as an evening's small indulgence, purchased and tucked away as a private souvenir of 4 days that already, even before the ship had reached New York, had begun to take on the particular soft, golden quality that pleasant memories acquire almost as soon as they are still being made. Let me offer one final small gathering of scenes before we let the night properly close around you. A few more brief glimpses I have been saving, because I think they round out the picture in a way worth having. In one stateroom, a woman who has spent the entire crossing quietly worried about a decision waiting for her back in New York, whether to finally support her sister through a difficult and expensive medical treatment against her husband's private reservations about the cost, finds herself, on this final night, arriving at a kind of clarity that 4 days of distance from home have somehow made possible in a way weeks of anxious deliberation at home never quite managed. She will support her sister. She has known it all along, really, underneath the anxious circling. Sometimes a person simply needs enough quiet, enough good food, enough gentle, unhurried evenings to hear what she already knew clearly enough to finally act on it. In another room, 2 sisters travelling together, one recently widowed and still finding her way through the particular strange fog of early grief, have spent this final evening exactly as they spent the previous 3, sitting together long after dinner in a shared stateroom, rather than venturing out to the smoking room or the reception room at all. The widowed sister grateful beyond words, though she has not quite managed to say so directly, for a sibling willing to simply sit beside her through this difficult season, without requiring her to perform recovery she does not yet feel. There is no dramatic resolution to this particular story tonight, only two sisters, quiet company, and the simple, considerable comfort of not having to grieve entirely alone. In the smoking room, one last hand of bridge concludes among the very latest remaining players, a modest sum changing hands with good-natured grumbling on one side and quiet satisfaction on the other, before all four men finally rise, stretch, and make their unhurried way toward their respective staterooms, the fire behind its brass surround finally allowed to burn all the way down now that the room's last occupants have departed. In the nursery, a young governess sits a while longer than strictly necessary beside a sleeping child not her own, watching the small, steady rise and fall of the child's breathing with the particular tenderness that comes easily to people whose work is caring for children, even when those children belong, by blood, to someone else entirely, before she too finally allows herself the rest she has more than earned after a long day of patient, attentive care. And in the corridor outside all of these rooms, the ship's own quiet machinery continues exactly as it has continued every single hour of this entire crossing, engines turning steadily, the whole enormous vessel moving on through calm, dark water toward a morning that will arrive, as mornings always do, whether anyone aboard is quite ready for it or not. But that is tomorrow's concern, and tomorrow is not yet here. Tonight belongs entirely to rest, to the particular deep, unhurried stillness that settles over any large sleeping household once every single one of its many small stories has finally, gently wound down toward quiet. I want to leave you, before we close, with one last image, the simplest one of all: a warm room, a soft bed, a body finally allowed to stop after a long day of carrying whatever it carried, of performing whatever it needed to perform, of managing whatever needed managing. That is what every single passenger aboard that ship was ultimately seeking each night, underneath every layer of silk and jewelry and careful social calculation, the same thing every one of us is seeking most nights, however plain or however grand the room around us happens to be. Simple rest. Nothing more complicated than that. Nothing less important either. Let me tell you about the specific quality of silence that settles over a ship like this one in these final hours, because it is not the same silence you might find in an ordinary house on land. There is always, underneath everything, that low, steady hum of engines, present in every room, felt through the floor, through the bed frame, through your own body if you press a palm flat against the wall beside you. This is a silence built on top of continuous motion rather than true stillness, a paradox most passengers stopped noticing by the second day of the crossing and simply absorbed into their own private definition of quiet. The way you might stop noticing the sound of rain against a window after the first hour of a long storm, present and constant, and eventually simply part of the texture of the evening rather than something separate from it. A passenger lying awake in her stateroom on any one of these 4 nights, unable for whatever reason to fall asleep as quickly as she might have liked, could listen, if she paid close enough attention, to an entire layered symphony of small ship sounds beneath that steady engine hum. The occasional distant creak of the vessel's enormous steel structure settling almost imperceptibly against the water's gentle motion, a far-off door closing somewhere down the corridor, muffled by thick carpet and heavy paneling into something closer to a soft thud than any sharp sound. Very rarely, carried faintly through a porthole left slightly open for air, the distant call of a crew member somewhere on deck, brief and businesslike, gone again almost before it registered as a genuine interruption to the prevailing quiet. I think there is something worth noticing in how quickly the unfamiliar becomes familiar, how a sound that might have kept a passenger anxiously awake on her very first night aboard, that low mechanical hum, that occasional distant creak, had become by this 4th and final night not merely tolerable but genuinely comforting, a kind of auditory proof that the ship continued its steady, reliable progress exactly as it should, carrying her safely onward while she rested. We adapt remarkably quickly to whatever surrounds us consistently enough, wealthy passengers aboard the grandest ship of their era, no differently than any of us adapting to the particular sounds of our own homes, the specific creak of a particular stair, the hum of a refrigerator in the next room, sounds that would startle a stranger, and that we ourselves barely register at all after enough nights of hearing them. Perhaps that is worth carrying with you tonight as well, wherever you happen to be resting. Whatever small sounds surround you right now, the settling of an old house, the distant hum of traffic, the particular quality of quiet in your own familiar room, these are not intrusions into your rest. They are, in their own way, part of what makes this particular rest recognizably yours, the accumulated familiar texture of a place your body has already learned, without your ever consciously deciding to learn it, to associate with safety and stillness and the simple permission to finally let go. Somewhere behind all of this, further back than sound, further back than any single scene we have visited tonight, the actual sea continues its own ancient, patient work, indifferent to ships and passengers and elaborate 10-course dinners alike, exactly as it continued before any of these particular people were born, and exactly as it will continue long after every single evening we have described tonight has passed entirely out of living memory and into simple, quiet history. There is something genuinely restful in that scale, I think, in remembering, gently, at the very end of a long day, how small any single evening actually is against something so vast and so old and so entirely unconcerned with any of it. Your own worries tonight, whatever they happen to be, are held inside that same vast patient indifference, and there is real comfort available in that, if you let yourself feel it. You do not have to carry everything alone tonight. You never really did. One more small thought before we let this evening finally close all the way. Every single person we have followed tonight, Eleanor and Henry and Margaret and Walter, the sisters sharing quiet grief, the mother watching her daughter across a crowded table, the father testing his son's readiness for a larger inheritance than either of them had yet said aloud. All of them believed, without any particular reason to doubt it, that many more evenings exactly like this one still waited ahead of them, more dinners, more crossings, more ordinary Tuesdays and Sundays stretching comfortably into an assumed future neither wealth nor careful planning can ever actually guarantee to anyone. I do not say that to trouble your rest tonight. I say it because I think it points towards something worth holding gently rather than anxiously, a kind of quiet appreciation for exactly this evening, exactly this bed, exactly this particular ordinary night you are resting in right now. Not because anything is wrong, or because tonight is somehow more fragile than any other night. Simply because every evening, examined closely enough, turns out to be this rare and this worth noticing, whether it happens aboard the grandest ship ever built, or in the plainest, most familiar room you know. The ordinary comfort of being warm, being safe, being cared for in whatever quiet way your own life currently provides, is never actually as ordinary as it feels from the inside. It is each time its own small, complete, sufficient gift. Rest easy in that thought if you can, not with any weight or urgency behind it, just a soft, settled kind of gratitude, the kind that asks nothing further of you tonight except to simply notice, briefly, how good it feels to finally be still. There is a very particular hour, somewhere between 1 and 2 in the morning, when even a ship this large and this busy comes as close as it ever comes to true stillness. The kitchens have gone quiet, the smoking room has finally emptied, the corridors hold nothing but low electric light and the occasional soft footstep of a steward on his final round. Even the orchestra members, packed away and resting now in their own shared quarters, have stopped, for a few hours at least, thinking about tomorrow's repertoire at all. It is into this particular hour, this particular stillness, that I want to leave you tonight, drifting somewhere between the last clear thought you can remember having and whatever comes after it, warm, unhurried, entirely free of any further obligation until whenever you choose to wake again. There is nothing else required of you. There is nothing else required of anyone aboard that ship either. Not tonight, not in this particular quiet hour we have spent so long, so gently, arriving at together. Let yourself settle now the way this whole ship settled, slowly, unevenly, one small quiet room at a time. Somewhere behind you, if you like, you can still hear the faintest trace of that orchestra, not playing anything in particular anymore, just a soft, unplaceable warmth of sound, the kind that lingers in a room for a little while after the actual music has stopped, the way a scent lingers after someone has already left. The dining saloon is dark now, every chair pushed neatly back in, every white cloth cleared and folded, waiting for tomorrow's breakfast service to begin the entire beautiful performance again in just a few hours. But that is tomorrow's concern, not yours, not tonight. Tonight there is nothing at all left for you to attend to, no gown to be laced, no seating chart to be redrawn, no careful conversation to be steered, no rival's jewelry to be quietly noted and measured against your own. Just this. The low, steady hum of the engines, felt more than heard, a sound so constant and so gentle that it stops registering as sound at all after a while, and becomes something closer to simple stillness itself. The particular quality of dark behind a stateroom porthole at this hour, no moon visible tonight, only that impossibly clear scatter of stars we noticed earlier, unhurried, indifferent, exactly where they have always been, and exactly where they will still be tomorrow. If you are still holding anything in your body right now, in your shoulders, in your jaw, in that small tight place just behind your eyes, let it go the way Eleanor's corset finally loosened, stay by stay, each one releasing a little more than the last, until there is nothing left holding you rigid at all. You do not need to be dressed for anything right now. You do not need to be seen, or admired, or correctly placed at any table according to any careful calculation of who outranks whom. You are simply here, warm, horizontal, entirely off duty for the night. Think, if you like, of Margaret, 71 years old, and utterly unbothered by anyone else's opinion of how she chooses to spend her evening, taking her own quiet pleasure in a cup of chamomile tea and an early close to the day. There is real wisdom in that, in learning, eventually, exactly what actually brings you rest, and simply choosing it, without apology, without needing anyone else's evening to look the same as yours. Think of Henry, alone in his stateroom with his half-finished novel, not lonely exactly, just quietly, comfortably himself, finding in one good unexpected conversation with a stranger enough warmth to carry him gently towards sleep. You do not need a ballroom full of people to feel, at the end of a long day, that the day was worth having. Think of the stewardess moving softly through a darkened corridor on her final rounds, checking that every small thing is exactly as it should be, before she too is finally allowed to rest. Someone, somewhere, is always quietly making sure everything is all right. Tonight, let that thought be yours to hold on to, rather than yours to provide for anyone else. The ship keeps moving beneath all of this, steady and unhurried, 22 knots through calm black water, closer with every passing minute to a harbour none of tonight's sleepers need to think about yet. There is nowhere else you need to be either, not for a while yet. No alarm has been set for the small hours. No obligation waits just past this moment, demanding your attention. There is only this long, wide, unhurried stretch of dark ahead of you, exactly the way there was for every passenger we have followed tonight, exactly the way there is, most nights, for you. Feel the particular heaviness settling into your own body now, the same heaviness that settled into Walter's shoulders once he finally allowed himself to simply enjoy an evening without the old habitual vigilance running beneath it. You do not have to prove anything to this room, to this night, to whatever is waiting for you tomorrow. You have already done enough today. Whatever got done, got done. Whatever did not get done will still be there, patient and unchanged, whenever you eventually turn your attention back to it. Tonight is not for that. Let your breathing slow the way a room slows once the last guests have finally gone home. That particular settling quiet that arrives only after all the performing and arranging and careful attending to other people has finally, blessedly concluded. In and out. No hurry behind either one. The engines keep their own steady rhythm somewhere far beneath you, patient, constant, asking nothing of you at all except to simply exist alongside them for a little while longer. If your mind wanders the way minds do at exactly this hour, toward tomorrow's small worries or today's unfinished conversations, let it wander gently, without following too closely, the way you might watch a light on the water from a distance without needing to swim out and investigate it. It will still be there in the morning if it matters. Most nights, by morning, it matters rather less than it seemed to at midnight. Picture, if it helps, that warm, scattered light we described earlier, hundreds of portholes glowing softly against endless dark water, visible for miles to anyone who might happen to be watching from somewhere far off. That is you right now, in a way, warm and lit from within, small against a vast dark night, entirely safe, entirely held, moving steadily toward whatever comes next without needing to do a single thing to make that movement happen. The ship carries you, the night carries you. You do not have to carry anything at all right now. Let your hands unclench wherever they have been resting. Let your feet go heavy and still beneath whatever blanket you have pulled up around yourself tonight. Let your eyes, if they have not already, finally allow themselves to close all the way Eleanor's did, the way Henry's did, the way every single tired, well-fed, thoroughly comfortable passenger aboard that ship allowed theirs to close on any one of those 4 calm, glittering, entirely ordinary evenings, never once suspecting how gently, how completely, sleep was about to arrive. There is one more small thing worth saying before we let this particular night finish settling all the way into sleep, and it is this. Nothing about tonight's comfort, imagined or real, needs to be earned the way those first-class passengers earned theirs, through inherited fortunes or careful business decisions made decades ago, or a wardrobe trunk full of Paris silk. Rest itself has never actually required any of that. It never did, even for them, not really. Underneath every layer of silk and jewelry and 10-course dinners, what actually let each one of them finally sleep each night was something far simpler and far more universal than any of it. A warm bed, a quiet room, a body finally allowed to stop performing and simply exist for a few hours. That part was never the luxury. That part has always been available, more or less, to anyone lucky enough to have found, on any given night, a safe, warm place to lay their head down. You have that tonight. Let that be enough. Let the room around you, whatever it actually looks like, however far it sits from a first-class stateroom on the grandest ship of its era, be exactly enough for this exact moment, because it is. You do not need anything else right now, not a better room, not a longer list of accomplishments from today, not a single other thing beyond precisely what you already have, right here, right now, in this particular quiet stretch of night. If you have made it this far with me tonight, thank you for staying, for letting this story carry you gently through 4 evenings that ended, for nearly everyone in them, exactly the way this one is ending for you now, softly, unremarkably, in warmth, in stillness, in the particular deep relief of a long day finally, fully done. That is all any evening, however grand or however ordinary, has ever really been reaching toward in the end. Not the 10 courses, not the jewelry, or the orchestra, or the careful, glittering performance of an entire evening's worth of wealth and status and belonging. Just this, a body finally at rest, a mind finally quiet, a night finally, gently, closing its door. Sleep now. There is nothing left to attend to, nothing left to arrange, nothing left standing between you and however many hours of rest you have ahead of you. The ship sails on without needing you to watch it any longer. The stars keep their own quiet watch overhead, exactly as they have every night for longer than any fortune, however vast, could ever measure. And you, wherever you are tonight, whatever kind of day brought you here, get to simply rest now, held by nothing more complicated than a warm bed and a quiet room, and the simple, ordinary, endlessly renewable permission to finally, completely let go. One last picture, and then I will let you go entirely. Picture the whole ship from far above now, the way no single passenger aboard her could ever actually see her. Every deck, every stateroom, every corridor we have walked through together tonight, all of it glowing softly against the vast dark water, moving steadily, patiently, unhurriedly onward through a calm and star-filled night. Somewhere inside all that warm, scattered light, Eleanor sleeps soundly beside her husband. Henry has finally set his book down for good. Margaret rests in the particular deep, satisfied way of a woman who has spent decades learning exactly what her own body and her own evening actually need. Walter sleeps without the old vigilance, for once, fully at ease. The sisters have finally drifted off together, side by side, grief a little lighter for having been shared rather than carried alone. And you, wherever you are tonight, whatever room actually surrounds you right now, are welcome to picture yourself held inside that same warm, glowing, gently moving stillness, carried forward through the night by something larger and steadier than any single worry you brought with you into this evening. Good night, friend. Thank you for spending this long, quiet evening with these 4 nights, with Eleanor and Henry and Margaret and Walter and all the other quiet, ordinary, extraordinary people who once shared this particular ship on this particular calm and clear week in a spring now many decades gone. I will be here again next time with another story whenever you are ready for one. Until then, rest well, sleep deeply, and let every small worry from today wait patiently for tomorrow, exactly as manageable as it actually is. You have earned this stillness, you have earned this rest. Let it hold you gently, all the way through the night, and let sleep come exactly as easily as it came for every warm, well-fed, thoroughly comfortable passenger settling into a soft bed on any one of those 4 calm evenings, never once needing to hurry toward it at all.